Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to travel back in time to a city of canals and counting houses to explore something remarkable, the birth of the world's first truly stable currency. We're going to Amsterdam in the early 1600s to discover how humans first solved one of our most persistent problems: how to create money that people could trust. This is the story of the Bank of Amsterdam, the Wisselbank, and the quiet revolution it created in how we think about value itself. If you enjoy these calm explorations of financial history, a like and subscribe really helps. And to those already here, thank you, so settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath. And let's begin our drift through the canals of Golden Age Amsterdam toward understanding how trust became currency. Amsterdam in the late 1500s was transforming into something the world had never quite seen before. Picture, if you can, a city built on water and ambition, where narrow houses with their distinctive gabled roofs pressed together along concentric rings of canals. The canals themselves were both streets and warehouses, filled with boats carrying goods from every corner of the known world. In the morning light you might see a ship just arrived from the Baltic, its hold full of grain and timber. By afternoon, another vessel from the East Indies would be unloading pepper and nutmeg and cinnamon, spices that were worth more than their weight in silver. The city smelled of the sea and of commerce, tar from the shipyards, exotic spices from distant warehouses, the ever-present scent of the canals themselves. The sounds were a constant symphony of trade. Ships creaking against their moorings, merchants calling out prices in a dozen different languages, the splash of oars, the rumble of barrels being rolled across cobblestones, the ring of hammers from the workshops that lined every street. This was a city in the midst of becoming. The Dutch Republic had only recently broken free from Spanish rule, a long and bitter war that wouldn't officially end until 1648, but Amsterdam wasn't waiting for peace to pursue prosperity. The city was growing faster than anyone could have imagined. New canals were being dug, new neighbourhoods laid out with mathematical precision. The population was exploding, from perhaps 30,000 people in 1560 to over 200,000 by 1650. And these weren't just native Amsterdammers. The city was filling with refugees and fortune seekers from across Europe. There were Portuguese Jews fleeing the Inquisition, bringing with them centuries of commercial expertise. There were Protestant merchants from the Spanish Netherlands, escaping religious persecution and bringing their capital and connections. There were Germans and Scandinavians and English and French, all drawn by the promise of a city where your religion mattered less than your ability to do business. Amsterdam was becoming a place where diversity wasn't just tolerated but celebrated, because diversity meant connections, and connections meant trade, and trade meant wealth. Walk through the city in, say, 1600, and you would see this diversity made tangible. A Portuguese merchant in fine dark clothing, conducting business from a canal-side office, a Baltic trader in furs negotiating for a shipment of herring, an English factor, that's what they called commercial agents, arranging insurance for a voyage to the Levant, and everywhere, constantly, the exchange of money. But here's where our story really begins, because money in 1600 Amsterdam was a problem, not the lack of it. There was plenty of money flowing through the city. The problem was that there were too many kinds of money, and none of them quite worked the way money is supposed to work. Imagine for a moment what it was like to conduct a simple transaction. You're a merchant, and you want to buy a shipment of Baltic wheat. You and the seller agree on a price, let's say 500 guilders. Simple enough, yes? But now comes the complication. You reach into your purse and pull out coins. Perhaps you have some Spanish reals, some French ecus, some German thalers, maybe some English shillings, and yes, some Dutch guilders too. Each coin is made of silver or gold, but each is a different size, a different weight, a different purity of metal. The seller looks at your coins and frowns. Are they genuine? Have they been clipped? That is, has someone shaved off tiny bits of the precious metal from the edges? Are they debased? Has the prince or king who minted them mixed in more copper than they should have, making the coins less valuable than they claim to be? And even if they're genuine and full weight, what exactly are they worth in relation to each other? So you don't just hand over the money. First, each coin must be inspected. Is the stamp clear? Does the weight feel right? Often the seller would take the coins to a money changer, a specialist who sat at tables throughout the city with scales and testing equipment. The money changer would weigh each coin, perhaps test its metal content by scratching it or using acid, and then pronounce its true value. For this service, the money changer would take a fee, of course. This meant that every significant transaction involved delays, disputes, and costs. A merchant spending his day buying and selling might visit the money changer a dozen times. The fees added up. The time wasted was significant, and there was always uncertainty. A coin that was accepted at face value in the morning might be rejected by afternoon if word spread that the prince who minted it had been debasing his currency. Money that you thought was worth one amount might suddenly be worth less, through no fault of your own. The problem extended beyond daily transactions. When you wanted to save money, where did you put it? There were private money changers who would hold deposits, certainly, but could you trust them? They might invest your money in risky ventures. They might simply disappear one day, taking your life savings with them. Or they might be perfectly honest but fall victim to robbery or fire, or any of the countless disasters that could befall a business in the 1700s. And then there was the bigger problem, the systemic one that affected everyone. Nobody could really agree on what anything was worth. If you couldn't trust that a guilder today would be worth a guilder tomorrow, how could you plan? How could you make long-term investments? How could you lend money with confidence that you'd be repaid in currency of equal value? The technical term for this problem is monetary chaos, but that's too abstract. Let me make it more concrete. Picture a merchant, let's call him Peter, who had worked for 30 years building his trade in textiles. He had been careful, prudent, saving a portion of his profits each year. By 1600, he had accumulated what should have been a comfortable retirement, a chest full of silver coins of various types. But when Peter actually tried to use this money, he discovered it was worth far less than he'd thought. Some coins had been declared invalid by the governments that issued them. Others had been so widely clipped and debased that money changers would only accept them at a fraction of their face value. Peter's lifetime of savings, which should have secured his old age, could barely buy a year or two of modest living. This wasn't Peter's fault. He hadn't been foolish or unlucky. The system itself was broken. And stories like Peter's were common enough that everyone understood the problem. Money, the very foundation of commerce, the thing that was supposed to make trade easier, had become an obstacle. There were hundreds of different types of coins circulating in Amsterdam. Literally hundreds. Coins from Spain and Portugal, from the various German principalities, from France and England and Poland and Sweden and Denmark. Some were newly minted and full weight. Others were decades old and worn thin from use. Some were official currency from recognized governments. Others were private issues of questionable legitimacy. Some were pure silver or gold. Others were clever mixtures of precious metal and base metal, designed to look more valuable than they were. The money changers made fortunes from this chaos, of course. They were the ones with the expertise to navigate it. With the scales and the knowledge of current exchange rates, and the connections to know which currencies were reliable and which weren't. But their profits were society's loss, fees and delays and uncertainty that added cost to every transaction. And it wasn't just merchants who suffered. Ordinary workers were paid in this jumble of coins. When a labourer received his wages at the end of the week, he had to immediately assess what he'd actually been paid. Were the coins good? Should he rush to spend them before they lost value? Should he try to exchange them for better coins, paying a money changer's fee to do so? The cognitive burden, the sheer mental energy required to simply use money, was exhausting. The city authorities understood the problem. The burgomasters and regents who governed Amsterdam, these were the wealthy merchant families who formed the city's oligarchy. They saw how monetary chaos was hindering trade. They knew that Amsterdam's prosperity depended on being a place where commerce could flow smoothly. They understood that trust was the foundation of trade, and the chaos of currency was eroding trust. Various solutions had been tried over the years. There were attempts to standardize coins, to ban certain types of debased currency, to prosecute clippers and counterfeiters more vigorously. Some cities had established regulations about which coins had to be accepted and at what rates. But these measures never quite worked. The fundamental problem remained. There were too many different kinds of money, and no way to ensure that any of them would hold their value. What Amsterdam needed was something radical. Not just a reform of the existing system, but a new system entirely. They needed to create money that worked differently, money that people could trust, not because they tested the metal content, but because the money itself was backed by something more reliable than any prince's promise. They needed to separate the idea of money from the physical coins themselves to create a new kind of value that existed in trust and accounting, rather than in metal you could hold in your hand. This was a revolutionary idea, and like most revolutionary ideas, it didn't emerge all at once. It grew slowly from the practical problems that merchants faced every day, from complaints and petitions and debates in the city council chambers, from the example of other cities that had tried similar experiments, from the unique combination of circumstances that made Amsterdam ready to try something new. The stage was set, the problem was clear, the city had the wealth, the commercial sophistication, and the political will to attempt a solution. All that remained was for someone to take the leap, to create something that had never quite existed before, a bank that would stabilize money itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand what made the Bank of Amsterdam revolutionary, we need to understand more deeply what money actually is and why creating stable money is so extraordinarily difficult. Let that question rest in your mind as we continue. What is money, really? And why is trust so hard to create and so easy to destroy? We'll explore these questions slowly, carefully, letting the answers unfold like the petals of a flower, opening in morning light. Let's step back from the bustling streets of Amsterdam for a moment and think about something more fundamental. What is money, really? It's a question that seems simple until you actually try to answer it. We use money every day, dozens of times, without thinking about it. But if someone asked you to explain what makes a piece of paper or a metal disc into money, what would you say? The easy answer is that money is whatever people agree to accept in exchange for goods and services. But that just pushes the question back a step. Why do people agree? What makes them trust that the money they accept today will be accepted by someone else tomorrow? For most of human history, money was valuable because it was made of something inherently valuable. Gold and silver primarily, but also copper, bronze, sometimes even iron. The logic seems straightforward. A gold coin is worth something because gold itself is valuable. You can make jewellery from it, use it for decoration, hoard it for its beauty. So a coin made of gold has value built into it, independent of any government's declaration or any merchant's acceptance. This is what economists call commodity money, money that has intrinsic value because it's made of a valuable commodity. And for thousands of years, this seemed like the only possible kind of money. The ancient Greeks used silver coins, the Romans used gold and silver and bronze. Medieval Europe used gold florins and silver groats and pennies. The logic of metal money was so obvious, so natural seeming, that it was hard to imagine any alternative. But commodity money has a fundamental problem, and it's the same problem that was plaguing Amsterdam in 1600. The problem is that the value of the commodity can change, and more importantly, the commodity itself can be corrupted. Think about a gold coin. Let's say it's supposed to contain 1 ounce of pure gold. If you could trust that it really contained 1 ounce of pure gold, then its value would be clear and stable. But can you trust that? The prince who minted the coin might have mixed in some copper or silver to stretch his gold supply. The coin might have started as pure gold, but been clipped by countless hands over the years, each person shaving off a tiny amount. The coin might be counterfeit, gold-plated lead designed to fool you. Even if the coin is genuine and pure, how do you know it weighs what it's supposed to weigh? Gold is soft. Coins wear down through use. A coin that was minted at 1 ounce might now weigh only 9/10 of an ounce. Is it still worth the same? Should you accept it at face value or demand a discount? These weren't theoretical problems. They were everyday realities that made commerce difficult and uncertain. Every transaction required judgment calls about the quality and weight of coins. And because everyone knew that coins were unreliable, there was constant incentive to pass off bad coins while hoarding good ones. There's actually a name for this phenomenon, though it wouldn't be formally articulated until the 16th century by an English merchant named Thomas Gresham. We call it Gresham's Law. Bad money drives out good money. The logic is simple, but profound. If you have two coins that are officially worth the same, say 2 1-guilder pieces, but one is pure silver and the other is debased with copper, which one will you spend and which will you save? Obviously, you'll spend the bad coin and save the good one. Everyone makes the same rational choice. The result is that good coins disappear from circulation, hoarded or melted down for their metal content, while bad coins proliferate. The money supply becomes increasingly degraded, which creates even more uncertainty and mistrust. It's a vicious cycle. The princes and kings who ruled European states in the 16 and 1700s understood this problem, but they were often part of the cause. Minting coins was a source of revenue for governments. The way it worked was straightforward. The government would take in, say, 100 ounces of silver from merchants or miners, mint it into coins, but make 105 ounces worth of coins by mixing in some base metal. The extra 5 ounces worth of coins was called seigniorage, the government's profit from minting. This seems harmless enough in small amounts. The government needs revenue, and providing currency is a service worth charging for. But there's always temptation to increase the seigniorage, to debase the currency more and more. When governments needed money for wars or palaces or to pay off debts, the easiest solution was often to debase the coinage. Call in all the old coins, melt them down, mix in more base metal, and issue more coins from the same amount of precious metal. In the short term, this worked. The government got more money to spend, but in the long term it destroyed trust in the currency. Merchants knew what was happening. They responded by raising prices, demanding more of the debased coins in exchange for goods. The government's gain was temporary, but the damage to the currency was lasting. Spain, which had controlled the Netherlands before the Dutch revolt, was notorious for this. The Spanish crown, despite having access to enormous quantities of silver from mines in the Americas, repeatedly debased its currency to finance wars and imperial adventures. Spanish reals, which should have been silver coins of known weight and purity, became increasingly unreliable. This was one of many reasons why Spanish economic power declined over the course of the 1600s, even as Spanish silver flooded into Europe. But it wasn't just governments that corrupted coins. Private individuals did too, through what was called clipping. Imagine you have a silver coin in your pocket. The coin is round, with stamped designs on both faces, but the edge is unadorned. What if you very carefully used a small file or scissors to shave off just a tiny bit of silver from the edge? The coin would still look basically the same, still be accepted in transactions, but you'd have a little pile of silver dust that you could collect and eventually sell. If everyone clipped just a tiny amount, and everyone accepted slightly clipped coins because refusing them would mean refusing most coins, then clipping became rational. And because it was rational, it was widespread. Coins in circulation might be 10 or 20% lighter than they were supposed to be. The older a coin, the more it had been clipped, so old coins were worth less than new coins, even if they had started out identical. Counterfeiting was another constant problem. The technology for minting coins wasn't particularly sophisticated in the 1600s. The dyes used to stamp designs onto coins could be copied by skilled metalworkers, and while making a perfect counterfeit was difficult, making a good enough counterfeit was possible. Mix base metal with just enough precious metal to pass casual inspection, stamp it with a copied dye, and you had fake money that might circulate for months or years before being detected. All of these problems, debasement, clipping, counterfeiting, simple wear and tear, meant that commodity money wasn't actually as stable as it seemed. Yes, the money was made of valuable metal, but you couldn't trust how much valuable metal any particular coin contained. Every transaction required verification, and even verification wasn't foolproof. Now, let's think about what money is supposed to do. Economists identify 3 main functions. First, money is a medium of exchange. Instead of bartering, trading your wheat directly for someone else's cloth, you sell your wheat for money, then use that money to buy cloth from someone else. Money makes trade easier by solving what's called the double coincidence of wants problem. Without money, you need to find someone who has what you want and wants what you have. With money, you just need to find someone who has what you want and is willing to sell for money, which is much easier. Second, money is a store of value. If you produce more wheat than you need right now, you can sell it for money and save the money for later. The money holds value across time, allowing you to shift your purchasing power from today to tomorrow or next year, or whenever you need it. This is crucial for any kind of saving or planning for the future. Third, money is a unit of account. It's the measuring stick by which we determine the value of things. A loaf of bread costs 1 guilder. A cow costs 50 guilders. This allows us to compare the value of completely different things and to make rational economic decisions. Should I buy a cow or 50 loaves of bread? Well, that depends on my needs, but at least I can make the comparison because both are priced in the same unit. For money to work well, it needs to fulfill all three functions. But the monetary chaos of early modern Europe meant that money was failing at all three. As a medium of exchange, the chaos of currencies made every transaction complicated. You couldn't simply hand over money. You had to negotiate which coins would be accepted and at what value. This added time and cost to every trade. As a store of value, unstable currency was disastrous. Remember our merchant Peter from earlier, who saved for 30 years only to find his savings nearly worthless? When you can't trust that money will hold its value, saving becomes irrational. Better to spend immediately or to convert money into physical goods, land, buildings, commodities, that might hold value better than coins. As a unit of account, multiple competing currencies made comparison nearly impossible. Is a cow worth 50 Spanish reals, or 40 French écus, or 60 Dutch guilders? Well, it depends on the current exchange rates between those currencies, which fluctuate daily based on the perceived quality of each type of coin. You need to be a mathematical genius just to go shopping. The human cost of all this was significant. Imagine being an ordinary worker in Amsterdam in 1600. You labour all week at the docks, loading and unloading ships. On Saturday, your employer pays you your wages. You're handed a collection of coins, some Dutch, some German, some Spanish. You look at them with a sinking feeling. Are they good coins? You're not an expert, you don't have access to scales or testing equipment. You have to hope they're worth what they're supposed to be worth. You rush to the market before it closes because you need to buy food for your family for the coming week. At the baker's shop, you offer coins for bread. The baker examines them skeptically. He accepts some, but demands 2 of your Spanish reals for a loaf, even though officially 1 real should be enough. Why? Because he knows those reals are old and clipped, worth less than their face value. You don't have a choice. You need the bread. You pay what he asks. By the time you've bought bread and some cheese and a bit of meat, your week's wages are nearly gone, and you have no way of knowing whether you got a fair deal or were cheated. There's no stable reference point, no way to be sure of value. This uncertainty is exhausting and demoralizing. You work hard, but the fruits of your labor slip through your fingers, diminished by a monetary system you don't understand and can't control. The psychological burden was perhaps the worst part. In a world where money constantly shifts in value, where you can't trust what things cost or what you're being paid, anxiety becomes chronic. You can't plan. You can't save with confidence. You live perpetually in the moment because the future is too uncertain. Now you might be thinking, couldn't people just stop using coins altogether? Couldn't they go back to barter or find some other solution? In practice, no. Once an economy reaches a certain level of complexity, money becomes necessary. The efficiency gains from using money rather than barter are too large to give up. A city like Amsterdam, with international trade and specialized labor and complex supply chains, couldn't function without money. But what if money itself could be reimagined? What if instead of tying value to physical objects, coins that could be clipped and debased and counterfeited, value could be recorded in a different way? What if money could exist as accounting entries, as numbers in a ledger, backed not by the metal content of coins, but by something more reliable? This is where the story gets interesting, because there had been experiments with this kind of money before Amsterdam. The Italians, particularly in Venice and Genoa, had developed sophisticated banking systems where merchants could hold deposits and make payments by transferring credits from one account to another. This bank money, as it was called, existed primarily as ledger entries. A merchant with an account at a bank didn't need to carry coins around. He could write an order directing the bank to pay someone else from his account. The bank would simply adjust the numbers in its ledgers, debiting one account and crediting another. This system had obvious advantages. It was safer than carrying large amounts of coins. It was faster, no need to count and weigh and verify coins. It created a kind of money that was more stable than physical coins, because it was one step removed from the chaos of debasement and clipping. But the Italian banks had never quite solved the fundamental problem of trust. How could depositors be sure that the bank actually had the money it claimed to have? Banks were private enterprises, run for profit. They took in deposits, but they also made loans and investments. There was always the risk that a bank might overextend itself, that it might promise more in deposits than it could actually pay out. Bank failures were common, and when a bank failed, depositors lost everything. The other problem with Italian bank money was that it never fully replaced coin money. Bank money was useful for large merchants making substantial transactions, but ordinary people still used coins. So you had two parallel monetary systems which created its own complications and inefficiencies. What Amsterdam would create was different. Not just another version of what the Italians had done, but something new. A bank that was public, not private. A bank whose purpose was not profit but stability. A bank that would maintain strict reserves, never lending or investing depositors' money, existing purely to provide trustworthy money for commerce. But before they could create this bank, before they could solve the problem of money, they needed to fully understand what they were trying to accomplish. They needed to recognize that money isn't ultimately about metal or coins or physical objects. Money is about trust. It's about believing that what you accept as valuable today will be accepted as valuable tomorrow. It's about having confidence in the system itself. The challenge was creating institutions that could maintain that trust over time. Institutions that wouldn't succumb to the temptations that had corrupted so many currencies. Institutions that would put stability above profit, the collective good above individual gain. This required not just technical financial expertise, but political will and civic virtue. It required a society that valued long-term prosperity over short-term gain, that understood the importance of trust and was willing to create systems to maintain it. Amsterdam in the early 1600s was becoming that kind of society. The city's merchant elite, who governed as burgomasters and sat on the city council, understood commerce intimately. They knew that their own wealth depended on Amsterdam remaining a trusted centre of trade. They had the sophistication to understand monetary theory and the political power to implement solutions. And crucially, they had examples to learn from, both the successes of Italian banking and the failures of debased currencies elsewhere. The pieces were coming together. The problem was clear: monetary chaos undermining trust and hindering commerce. The theoretical solution was emerging: create a new kind of money, backed not by the shifting value of metal coins, but by the stability of public institutions. What remained was the practical work of making it real, of creating a bank that would transform theory into trusted currency. Let these ideas settle for a moment. Think about how strange and arbitrary our monetary systems are when you really examine them. We accept that certain objects or numbers have value, because everyone else accepts it, and everyone else accepts it because we do. It's a collective agreement, a shared belief, a social consensus that creates something real and powerful from nothing but trust. When that trust fails, as it had failed in Amsterdam before 1609, the consequences ripple through every aspect of life. But when institutions can maintain trust, when systems can be built that people believe in, then remarkable things become possible. Money can be stable, commerce can flourish, people can plan for futures beyond tomorrow. The question Amsterdam faced was whether such institutions could actually be created and sustained. Whether human beings, with all our short-term impulses and self-interest, could build systems that served the collective good even when individual temptation pulled in other directions. That question still matters today. We still wrestle with how to create trustworthy money, how to build institutions that maintain stability, how to balance innovation with safety. The technologies have changed, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. Trust is hard to build and easy to destroy. Stability requires discipline. Systems must be designed to resist corruption even when corruption offers short-term rewards. Amsterdam was about to attempt something revolutionary. They were about to bet that it was possible to create money that people could trust not because of what it was made of, but because of the institutions that backed it. Whether they would succeed remained to be seen. To understand why Amsterdam was uniquely positioned to solve the problem of money, we need to understand the remarkable society that had emerged in the Dutch Republic by the early 1600s. This was a place unlike anywhere else in Europe, a society that had, almost accidentally, created the conditions necessary for financial innovation. The story begins with a war. In 1568, the provinces that would become the Netherlands rose in revolt against their Spanish rulers. This wasn't a sudden explosion, but a long, grinding conflict that would last 80 years. The reasons were tangled: religion, taxes, local autonomy, a dozen grievances that accumulated until they became unbearable. The Spanish king Philip II was Catholic and increasingly intolerant. Many Dutch were Protestant, particularly Calvinist. Philip demanded high taxes to fund his wars across Europe. The Dutch resented being governed from distant Madrid by rulers who didn't understand or care about local traditions. What began as protests and petitions escalated into armed rebellion. The Spanish responded with brutal force. Cities were besieged and sacked. Thousands were killed. The conflict might have ended with Spanish victory. Spain was, after all, the most powerful empire in the world, with vast resources from its American colonies. But the Dutch had geography on their side. Their land was laced with rivers and marshes crossed by dikes and canals. They could flood fields to stop Spanish armies, retreat to fortified cities, hold out behind water barriers. And they had something else, a cause that attracted support from across Europe. Protestant refugees from Spanish persecution fled to the Netherlands. Merchants who resented Spanish economic control moved their businesses north. Money and expertise poured into the rebel provinces, particularly into Holland, the richest province, and its major cities: Amsterdam, Leiden, Haarlem, Rotterdam. By 1600, the shape of the future was becoming clear. The southern provinces, what is now Belgium, remained under Spanish control. But the northern provinces, the 7 united provinces that called themselves the Dutch Republic, had effectively won their independence even though the war would officially continue for decades more. And Amsterdam, which had been merely important in 1560, was becoming the commercial centre of Europe. The transformation was breathtaking. The city that had perhaps 30,000 people in 1560 had nearly 70,000 by 1600. It would grow to over 200,000 by 1650, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. But numbers don't capture the nature of this growth. Amsterdam was becoming a city unlike any other. First, consider the physical expansion. The medieval core of Amsterdam was small, confined by old city walls. As population exploded, the city had to grow outward. But Amsterdam didn't sprawl haphazardly. Instead, the city authorities planned systematic expansion. They laid out concentric rings of canals, the famous Grachtengordel, the canal belt. Each canal was lined with plots of land sold to wealthy merchants who built the tall, narrow houses that became Amsterdam's architectural signature. These weren't just houses. They were business premises, warehouses, and homes all in one. The ground floor might contain offices where merchants conducted business. Upper floors would be living quarters for the merchant's family. The attic, accessible by a hoist mounted on the gable, would be storage space for goods. The canal in front provided transportation. Boats could pull up directly to deliver or collect merchandise. The planning was remarkable. Streets were laid out in neat grids. Plots were sold with regulations about building heights and materials to maintain consistency. Bridges crossed canals at regular intervals. The result was a city that was both beautiful and functional, where aesthetics served commerce and commerce created beauty. The city was built quite literally on commerce. Even the land itself was commercial. Amsterdam sits at sea level, on marshy ground that's naturally unsuitable for building. Every structure required foundations driven deep into the mud, massive wooden piles that would support the weight of brick buildings. This was expensive and technically challenging, but Amsterdam's merchants had the money and the engineering skill to do it. They were building wealth on water, creating solid ground from determination and capital. Ships were everywhere. Amsterdam's harbour was one of the busiest in the world. On any given day, hundreds of vessels might be anchored there. Small coastal traders, medium-sized merchant ships, large ocean-going vessels. They came from the Baltic loaded with grain and timber and tar and iron. They came from France with wine and salt. They came from the Mediterranean with fruits and olive oil and luxury textiles. And increasingly, They came from much farther away. In 1602, Amsterdam merchants founded the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, better known by its initials VOC. This was something unprecedented, a joint stock company chartered to conduct trade with Asia and granted monopoly rights to do so on behalf of the Dutch Republic. Instead of individual merchants risking their own capital on dangerous voyages to the East Indies, the VOC pooled capital from many investors. You could buy shares in the company, and you would receive a portion of the profits proportional to your investment. The VOC was wildly successful. Its ships sailed to Java and the Spice Islands, to Ceylon and India and Japan. They brought back pepper and nutmeg and cloves and cinnamon, spices that Europeans valued absurdly highly. A ship that survived the round-trip voyage could return cargo worth 10 or 20 times its cost. Even accounting for the ships that sank, or were captured by pirates or simply disappeared, the profits were enormous. The VOC changed Amsterdam profoundly. It brought in wealth, obviously, but also connections and information. Amsterdam became the place where you could learn about conditions in Asian markets, where you could arrange to buy or sell goods from across the world, where you could find investors for ambitious ventures. The city became a node in a global network of trade. But it wasn't just exotic spices and East Indies trade. Amsterdam was also crucial for more mundane but equally important commerce. The Baltic trade, for instance, was the foundation of Dutch prosperity. Ships brought grain from Poland and Prussia to Amsterdam, where it was traded and distributed throughout Western Europe. Amsterdam became Europe's granary, the place that ensured food supply. When harvests failed elsewhere, Amsterdam's warehouses held enough grain to prevent famine. The herring trade was another pillar. The Dutch had perfected techniques for catching, preserving, and packing herring. Salted herring was a staple food across Europe. Dutch fishing fleets ranged across the North Sea, bringing in vast quantities that were processed in Dutch ports and shipped everywhere. It was unglamorous, but it employed thousands and generated steady, reliable income. Then there was shipbuilding. The Dutch built the most efficient cargo vessels in Europe, the Vloot, a ship design that sacrificed armament and speed for cargo capacity and ease of handling. A flight could carry more goods with fewer crew than traditional ships, which meant lower costs and higher profits. Other nations tried to copy the design, but Dutch shipyards remained the most efficient and productive in Europe. All of this commerce required supporting services. Marine insurance emerged as a sophisticated business. You could insure your ship and cargo against the risks of loss at sea. Shipbrokers arranged charters and cargoes. Commodity traders specialized in particular goods, becoming experts in markets for grain or timber, or wine or spices. Banks and money lenders provided capital. Legal services helped draft contracts and resolve disputes. The city became a vast humming engine of commerce, and this commerce created wealth that was distributed more broadly than in most European societies. Yes, there were immensely rich merchants at the top, but there was also a substantial middle class of smaller traders, shop owners, skilled artisans and professionals. Even ordinary workers in Amsterdam were relatively well paid compared to their counterparts elsewhere. Because labour was in demand and workers could bargain for better wages, this economic structure had political consequences. The Dutch Republic wasn't a monarchy. There was a stadtholder, a position held by the House of Orange, but the stadtholder's power was limited. Real authority rested with the States General, an assembly of representatives from the 7 provinces, and within each province, power rested with the provincial estates dominated by wealthy merchants and landowners. In Amsterdam specifically, governance was in the hands of the Vroedschap, the city council, composed of regents, members of the merchant oligarchy. These were men who had made fortunes in trade and now managed the city's affairs. They understood commerce intimately because they were merchants themselves. When they made policy decisions, they considered how those decisions would affect trade and prosperity. This created a virtuous cycle. Good governance attracted more merchants. More commerce created more wealth. More wealth allowed investment in infrastructure and institutions. Better infrastructure and institutions attracted still more commerce. Amsterdam became a self-reinforcing success. The society that emerged was, by the standards of the time, remarkably open and tolerant. This wasn't ideological tolerance necessarily. The Dutch weren't more enlightened than other Europeans in some abstract sense, It was practical tolerance. Persecution and exclusion were bad for business. If you drove away talented people because of their religion or ethnicity, you lost their skills and capital. If you insisted on religious conformity, you limited your trading partners and connections, so Amsterdam became a refuge. Portuguese Jews fleeing the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal established themselves in Amsterdam and brought with them commercial networks stretching across the Mediterranean and to the New World. They became crucial players in trade with Brazil and the West Indies. French Huguenots, Protestant refugees from Catholic France, contributed expertise in luxury crafts and international commerce. Germans and Scandinavians came seeking opportunity. Even Catholics, though technically discriminated against, could practice their religion quietly and participate in business openly. Walk through Amsterdam in, say, 1620, and you would hear a babble of languages. Dutch, of course, but also Portuguese and Spanish, French and German, English and Polish and Danish. In the commercial districts, in the coffee houses where merchants gathered to exchange information and negotiate deals, you might hear all of these languages in the space of an hour. The cultural effects of this diversity and prosperity were extraordinary. Amsterdam became a centre of printing and publishing. Books banned elsewhere could be printed in Amsterdam and distributed across Europe. The city attracted artists. Rembrandt van Rijn painted his masterpieces in Amsterdam. Johannes Vermeer worked in nearby Delft. Hundreds of lesser-known but still talented painters found patrons among Amsterdam's wealthy merchants who wanted portraits of themselves and their families, paintings of their possessions, pictures of their city. This was the golden age of Dutch painting, and it was funded by commerce. Merchants commissioned paintings the way Italian nobles had commissioned paintings a century earlier, but the subjects were different. Dutch paintings showed ordinary life, domestic interiors, still lifes of food and flowers, landscapes and cityscapes. There was a democratic quality to it, an appreciation for the everyday world that reflected the values of a merchant society. Philosophy and science flourished too. René Descartes lived in Amsterdam for years, appreciating the intellectual freedom and the culture of inquiry. Baruch Spinoza, a Portuguese Jewish philosopher whose ideas were too radical for the synagogue, found space to think and write in Amsterdam. The city became a place where ideas could be debated and books published that would have been suppressed elsewhere. But here's the paradox at the heart of all this success. The prosperity was built on monetary chaos. All of this trade, all of this wealth creation was happening despite a monetary system that was fundamentally broken. Imagine how much more efficient commerce could be if the money itself worked properly. Imagine how much time and energy and resources were being wasted on the friction of dealing with hundreds of types of coins, with constant verification and negotiation and uncertainty. The merchants who governed Amsterdam understood this. They saw the costs every day in their own businesses. They received petitions from other merchants complaining about the monetary confusion. They watched as some traders gained unfair advantages through expertise in manipulating exchange rates or by passing off inferior coins. They knew that monetary chaos was a tax on every transaction, a drain on prosperity. Other cities had tried to solve similar problems. Venice had established a public bank, the Banco della Piazza di Rialto, in 1587. Genoa had the Banco di San Giorgio, which dated back to the 1400s. These Italian banks provided models, examples of how public banking could work. But they also provided cautionary tales, because these banks had had mixed success and had sometimes failed or had been compromised by lending to governments. Amsterdam's leaders studied these examples. They debated among themselves what might work in their own context. They considered the specific problems of Amsterdam's monetary chaos and what kind of institution might address them. They thought about the risks. A public bank could fail and damage the city's reputation. They weighed the potential benefits. Stable money could cement Amsterdam's position as Europe's commercial centre. The debates went on for years. This wasn't something to rush into. The stakes were high. Getting it wrong could be disastrous. But by the first years of the 1600s, consensus was building that something had to be done. The monetary problem was getting worse, not better. The chaos was beginning to seriously hinder trade. If Amsterdam was to maintain and expand its commercial dominance, it needed to solve the money problem. The city had the wealth to try something ambitious. It had the governmental capacity, a functioning, relatively uncorrupt administration, It had the commercial sophistication, merchants who understood finance and accounting and international trade. It had the political will, leaders who recognized the problem and were prepared to act. What it needed was the courage to try something new, to create an institution that hadn't quite existed before, a bank that would be public, not private, that would maintain strict reserves, not lend deposits, that would exist not to make profit but to provide stability. That would create a new kind of money, backed not by the variable quality of metal coins but by the reliability of public institutions. The pieces were in place. The need was clear. The opportunity was present. All that remained was the decision to act and the difficult work of turning vision into reality. Amsterdam stood at a moment of possibility, poised to create something that would transform not just their own city, but the very nature of money itself. Let that image rest in your mind for a moment. A city of canals and commerce, of diversity and dynamism, of practical merchants wrestling with profound questions about value and trust. A society that had built extraordinary prosperity despite working with broken tools, now preparing to forge better tools. The stage was set for innovation that would echo through centuries. The crisis that finally forced action didn't arrive as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow accumulation of frustration that reached an unbearable threshold. By the first years of the 1600s, the monetary chaos we've been discussing had intensified to the point where it threatened to undermine Amsterdam's commercial success. The problem was accelerating. As more trade flowed through Amsterdam, more different types of coins arrived with it. Each trading partner brought their own currency. English merchants paid in pounds sterling. Baltic traders used various German and Polish coins. Mediterranean commerce involved Spanish reals and Italian ducats. The VOC's eastern trade introduced exotic currencies from Asia. The sheer variety was overwhelming the system's capacity to cope. Money changers multiplied, setting up tables throughout the city's commercial districts. On busy days, the area around the exchange, the Beurs, where merchants gathered to conduct business, was lined with money changers, each with their scales and testing equipment, each charging fees for their services. The fees were substantial. Converting coins might cost 3 or 4 or 5% of the value. For a merchant operating on thin margins, these fees ate directly into profits, but the fees were only part of the cost. There was also time. A merchant concluding a significant transaction might spend hours getting coins assessed and converted. Time that could have been spent negotiating new deals or managing existing business was instead consumed by the mechanics of handling money. And even after paying for assessment, uncertainty remained. The money changer's judgment, while expert, wasn't infallible. A coin accepted today might be questioned tomorrow if word spread about some problem with that particular issue. The psychological burden was perhaps worse than the financial cost. Every merchant in Amsterdam operated under constant anxiety about money. Were the coins they accepted really worth what they seemed? When they paid their own bills, would their coins be accepted or challenged? Should they hoard certain types of coins because they seemed more stable? Should they rush to spend other coins before they lost value? These weren't abstract concerns, but daily practical worries that occupied mental energy and created chronic stress. Complaints to the city authorities increased. Merchant guilds submitted petitions describing the problems and requesting action. Individual traders wrote letters to burgomasters they knew personally, explaining how monetary chaos was affecting their business. Foreign merchants, particularly important ones whose business Amsterdam wanted to keep, made pointed comments about how much easier trade was in other cities with more stable currencies. The burgomasters and the Vrijdschap, the city council, listened to these complaints with growing concern. These weren't abstractions for them. The burgomasters were themselves merchants or had been before taking on civic duties. They understood the problems intimately because they experienced them personally. When they met to discuss city business, monetary reform was an increasingly frequent topic of conversation. The debates were serious and detailed. Various proposals were considered and argued over. Some suggested simply banning certain types of coins, refusing to accept anything that didn't meet strict standards of weight and purity. But this was impractical. How would you enforce it? And wouldn't it simply reduce the money supply so much that trade would be crippled? Others proposed establishing official exchange rates, decreeing by law what each type of coin was worth in relation to the Dutch guilder. But this too was problematic. How would you set the rates? Market conditions change constantly. A coin that was worth a certain amount today might be worth less tomorrow if its issuing government debased the currency further. Official rates that diverge from market reality would just create opportunities for arbitrage and smuggling. Some suggested stronger enforcement against clipping and counterfeiting, with harsh penalties to deter the practice. This was sensible as far as it went, but it addressed symptoms rather than causes. You could punish clippers, but as long as coins circulated for years and decades, they would inevitably wear down and be shaved. And counterfeiting was nearly impossible to prevent entirely when coin designs could be copied by skilled craftsmen. The more radical proposal was to create a public bank. This idea had been circulating for years, brought up periodically and then set aside as too complex or risky. But by 1607 or 1608, the idea was being discussed more seriously than ever before. The model that attracted most attention was the Venetian Bank, the Banco della Piazza di Rialto, established in 1587. Venice, like Amsterdam, was a commercial republic governed by merchants. The Venetians had faced similar monetary problems: too many types of coins, too much uncertainty, too much friction in commerce. Their solution had been to create a public bank where merchants could deposit coins and receive bank money in return. The beauty of the Venetian system was that it separated the unit of account from physical coins. Bank money, credits in the bank's ledgers, became the standard for measuring value. Merchants with accounts could make payments to each other simply by transferring bank credits, without handling physical coins at all. The bank maintained reserves of actual coins to back the credits, and depositors could withdraw coins if needed. But for most transactions, the bank credits were more useful than coins. This system had several advantages. Bank money was stable. It didn't get clipped or debased because it existed only as ledger entries. It was convenient. Transfers were faster and easier than counting and verifying coins. It was safer. Keeping money in the bank meant you didn't have to worry about theft or fire destroying a fortune kept at home. And it created a kind of network effect. The more merchants used the bank, the more useful bank money became, which encouraged even more merchants to use it. But the Venetian Bank also had problems that Amsterdam's leaders wanted to avoid. The Venetian Bank had sometimes lent money to the government, which compromised its reserves and created risks. It had been closed and reopened more than once due to financial difficulties, and it had never fully displaced coin money. Venetians still used both bank money and physical coins, which created its own complications. Amsterdam's merchants debated how to create a bank that would capture the advantages of the Venetian system, while avoiding its weaknesses. The discussions were detailed and sometimes contentious. Conservative merchants worried about the risks. What if the bank failed? Wouldn't that damage Amsterdam's reputation more than muddling through with the current system? What if the bank was mismanaged or became corrupt? How could they ensure that it would maintain strict standards over decades? Progressive merchants argued that the benefits outweighed the risks. Yes, there were dangers, but the status quo was unsustainable. Amsterdam was losing competitive advantage to cities that were developing more efficient financial systems. The English were creating new banking institutions. Other Dutch cities were considering similar measures. If Amsterdam didn't act, it might fall behind. There were also questions about how the bank should be structured. Should it be truly public, owned and operated by the city government, or should it be a private bank with special privileges granted by the city? Who would manage it? How would you ensure competent, honest administration? What rules would govern deposits and withdrawals? How much should be charged for services? The debate about reserves was particularly crucial. Some argued that the bank should maintain full reserves, that is, for every guilder of bank money in circulation, there should be an actual guilder's worth of precious metal in the vault. This would be absolutely safe. Bank money would be backed 100% by real assets. Depositors could be certain their money was available whenever they wanted it. Others suggested that partial reserves would be sufficient. If the bank kept, say, 50% reserves, it could use the other 50% for loans or investments, which would generate income. This income could fund the bank's operations and perhaps even provide dividends to the city treasury. After all, not everyone would want to withdraw their deposits simultaneously. Surely keeping half the deposits in reserve would be more than enough. This debate cut to the heart of what the bank was for. Was its purpose to provide absolutely reliable, stable money, even if that meant no profit? Or was its purpose to support the city's finances while also providing some monetary stability? The conservative position argued for the former, safety above all. The progressive position argued for the latter, why not gain some benefit from the idle reserves? The debate went on for months. Meetings of the Vroedschap devoted hours to discussing the various proposals. Burgomasters consulted with leading merchants to gauge opinion. Lawyers drafted and redrafted possible charters for the bank. Accountants worked out details of how the ledgers would be maintained and what fees would be charged. What finally tipped the balance toward action was a combination of factors. First, the monetary situation continued to deteriorate. By 1608, complaints were reaching a crescendo. Something had to be done, and soon. Second, the example of Venice showed that a public bank was at least possible, even if Venice's specific implementation had been imperfect. Amsterdam could learn from Venice's mistakes and do better. Third, several influential merchants who had been skeptical became convinced that the benefits outweighed the risks. When these respected figures threw their support behind the bank proposal, others followed. The crucial vote came in 1608. The Vroedschap met to decide whether to proceed with establishing a public bank. The debate that day was passionate but respectful. Those opposed raised their concerns one more time. Those in favour made their case. The balance of opinion had shifted. When the vote was called, the majority supported creating the bank. But supporting the idea in principle was one thing. Making it real required detailed decisions about exactly how the bank would work. Over the following months, a committee worked to finalise the bank's charter and rules. They decided that the bank would be owned and operated by the city. It would be managed by commissioners appointed by the burgomasters, respected men of proven integrity who would serve without salary as a civic duty. The bank would accept deposits of coins, which would be assessed and valued according to their actual precious metal content. In return, depositors would receive credits in bank money, units of account called banco guilders. These banco guilders would be stable, defined as containing a specific amount of pure silver, regardless of the chaotic variations in physical coins. Crucially, the committee decided on full reserves. Every banco guilder in circulation would be backed by an equivalent value of precious metal in the bank's vault. There would be no lending, no investing, no using deposits for any purpose except backing the bank money. This was conservative, but it was safe. It meant the bank couldn't generate profit from its reserves, but it also meant depositors could have absolute confidence that their money was there. Merchants with accounts would be able to make payments to other account holders simply by instructing the bank to transfer credits from one account to another. The bank's clerks would adjust the ledgers accordingly. No physical coins would change hands. This would make large transactions much faster and more convenient. The bank would charge fees for its services, a small percentage for deposits, fees for transfers, charges for withdrawals. These fees would fund the bank's operations, paying the clerks, maintaining the building, covering administrative costs. The fees would be much lower than money changers charged, making the bank an attractive option for merchants. To ensure the bank would be used, the city decreed that all bills of exchange above 600 guilders had to be settled through the bank. Bills of exchange were a common commercial instrument, essentially I owe us used in international trade. By requiring large bills to be settled through the bank, the city guaranteed that major merchants would need accounts. This would create the network effect necessary for success. The location chosen for the bank was symbolically important. It would be housed in the Amsterdam Town Hall, the seat of city government. This wasn't just practical, providing security for the vault and proximity to city authorities. It was also a statement. The bank was a public institution, backed by the full faith and credit of the city. Placing it in the town hall made that connection visible and tangible. The date for opening was set, January 31st, 1609. The announcement generated considerable interest and some skepticism. Merchants discussed it in the coffee houses and at the exchange. Would it work? Should they open accounts? What would happen to the money changers whose livelihoods depended on the current system? The city authorities undertook an information campaign, explaining how the bank would work and why merchants should use it. Pamphlets were printed and distributed. Burgomasters spoke at guild meetings. The commissioners who would manage the bank, respected merchants themselves, used their personal credibility to reassure hesitant traders. There was real anxiety in these final weeks before the opening. The city was committing significant resources and reputation to this experiment. If it failed, the embarrassment would be profound. Amsterdam's rivals would mock the presumption. Merchants might lose confidence in the city's leadership. The monetary chaos might become even worse if the failed bank added to the confusion. But there was also hope. The possibility that this might actually work, that Amsterdam might solve a problem that had plagued commerce for centuries, that money itself might be made reliable and trustworthy. This possibility was tantalizing. If they could pull this off, Amsterdam would gain an enormous advantage. Commerce would flow more smoothly. Costs would decrease. The city would attract even more trade as merchants sought the benefits of stable money. The commissioners chosen to manage the bank prepared for their responsibilities with a mixture of pride and apprehension. They understood that they were being entrusted with something important. The bank's success would depend on their integrity and competence. They would need to resist temptations. There would be pressures to lend the reserves, to bend the rules for powerful people, to use the bank for purposes beyond its mandate. They would need to maintain strict standards even when it would be easier or more profitable to relax them. The physical preparations were substantial. Space in the town hall had to be converted for the bank's use. Vaults needed to be constructed to hold the precious metal reserves. Ledgers had to be prepared, massive books with pages for recording deposits, withdrawals, and transfers. A staff of clerks had to be hired and trained in the procedures they would follow. Security measures had to be implemented to prevent theft or fraud. As January 1609 progressed, the work intensified. The opening date was approaching. The commissioners met frequently, reviewing procedures one more time, checking that everything was ready, preparing themselves for the moment when the doors would open and the experiment would begin. On the evening of January 30th, the night before the opening, imagine the mixture of emotions among those involved. The burgomasters who had pushed for the bank felt the weight of responsibility. If this worked, they would be celebrated for their vision. If it failed, they would be blamed for the disaster. The commissioners felt similar pressure, knowing that the bank's reputation would depend on their actions. The clerks were nervous about performing their duties correctly in what would surely be a hectic first day. Throughout Amsterdam, merchants debated whether to be among the first to open accounts. Some saw advantage in being early adopters, gaining experience with the system, demonstrating confidence, building relationships with the bank's management. Others preferred to wait and see, to let others take the risk of being first, to observe how the bank functioned before committing their money to it. And perhaps some people, the visionaries, the ones who could see beyond the immediate moment, sensed that something significant was about to happen. That Amsterdam was on the verge of creating an institution that would change not just their own city, but the very nature of commerce and finance. That this bank, if it succeeded, would become a model studied and copied across Europe. That the principles it embodied, public backing, full reserves, stable money as a public good, would influence financial thinking for centuries. But that night, none of that was certain. It was all potential, possibility, hope mixed with anxiety. The bank existed on paper, in the charter and the regulations, in the vault and the ledgers. But it didn't yet exist where it mattered most, in the trust and confidence of the merchants who would need to use it. Tomorrow would tell whether trust could be created through institutions and integrity, whether a new kind of money could be brought into existence through careful design and disciplined implementation, whether Amsterdam's bold experiment would succeed or fail. The city waited, suspended between the chaos of the past and the uncertain promise of the future. The morning of January 31st, 1609 arrived cold and grey, as winter mornings in Amsterdam typically did. The canals were frozen in places, their surfaces reflecting the pale sky. Smoke rose from thousands of chimneys as the city woke to its routines. For most people, this was an ordinary Wednesday, another day of work and commerce and the endless tasks of daily life. But for some, the burgomasters, the commissioners, the clerks waiting nervously in the town hall, this day marked the beginning of something new. The Bank of Amsterdam opened its doors at 9 o'clock that morning. The location, as we mentioned, was within the town hall itself, Amsterdam's centre of civic authority. The building stood on the dam, the square at the heart of the city, where the Amstel River had been dammed centuries ago to create the settlement that would become Amsterdam. It was a location both practical and symbolic. Practical because the town hall's thick walls and secure rooms could protect the bank's vault. symbolic because the placement announced that this bank was a public institution backed by the city's authority. The space allocated for the bank was on the ground floor, accessible from the street, but separated from public areas by heavy doors and the watchful presence of guards. Inside, the main room was dominated by a long counter where clerks would conduct business with depositors. Behind the counter were desks where the ledgers would be maintained. Massive books bound in leather, their pages ruled into columns for recording names, amounts, dates, transactions. And behind everything, accessible only to the commissioners and trusted officials, was the vault. The vault was the physical heart of the bank, though not its conceptual heart, that resided in the ledgers and the trust they represented. But the vault mattered enormously. This was where the precious metal reserves would be kept, the silver and gold that backed every banco guilder in circulation. The vault had been constructed with unusual care. Thick walls, multiple locks, guards posted at all hours. The commissioners took the security of the vault very seriously, understanding that any breach would destroy confidence in the bank. The first depositors began arriving shortly after the doors opened. These early adopters were mostly established merchants who had been convinced of the bank's benefits during the months of preparation. Some came because they genuinely believed in the concept and wanted to support it. Others came because the city's requirement that large bills of exchange be settled through the bank meant they needed accounts. A few came simply out of curiosity or because everyone else seemed to be doing it. The process of opening an account and making the first deposit was carefully choreographed. A merchant would approach the counter and state his intention to open an account. A clerk would take down his name and relevant information, his address, his trade, references from other merchants who could vouch for his reliability. The bank didn't accept accounts from just anyone. You needed to be established in business, known to the community, reputable. This selectivity served multiple purposes. It reduced the risk of fraud. It ensured that account holders would understand commercial practices and the bank's procedures, and it gave accounts a certain prestige. Having a bank account marked you as a serious merchant. Once the account was established, the depositor would present his coins. This was where the bank's innovation became tangible. The coins would be poured onto the counter, a clinking metallic pile of Spanish reals and German thalers and French écus and Dutch guilders and whatever other currencies the merchant had accumulated. The clerk would begin the process of assessment. Each coin would be examined individually. Is the stamp clear and genuine? Does the weight feel right? The clerk would use a scale to weigh coins, comparing them to standard weights kept at the bank. Coins that were significantly underweight, clipped or worn, would be valued accordingly. Coins of the proper weight would be accepted at their full rated value. But the value wasn't based on what the coin claimed to be worth. It was based on the actual precious metal content. This was crucial. A Spanish real might have a face value of one amount, but if the Spanish crown had debased the currency, the actual silver content might be less. The bank assessed based on reality, not official declarations. This meant that depositors couldn't pass off inferior coins at inflated values. The bank saw through debasement and clipping to the underlying truth. How much actual silver or gold does this coin contain? The assessment took time. For a large deposit, it might take an hour or more as clerks weighed and tested and calculated. But this time was an investment. Once the assessment was complete and the coins were accepted into the bank's vault, the depositor would never need to go through this process again with this money. The banco guilders credited to his account were stable, their value fixed and certain. After the assessment, the clerk would calculate the total value of the deposit in banco guilders. The banco guilder was defined precisely. It contained a specific amount of pure silver, equivalent to roughly 10 stuivers. This definition was public and unchanging. It meant that a banco guilder today would be worth exactly the same as a banco guilder tomorrow or next year or a decade from now. The stability that physical coins lacked, banco guilders possessed. The clerk would then record the deposit in the bank's ledger. The merchant's name, the date, the amount deposited. The entry would be made with careful script using ink that would last. These ledgers were permanent records, treated with the same respect as legal documents or sacred texts. The clerk would also give the depositor a receipt, a document confirming the deposit and the balance in his account, and that was it. The merchant now had an account at the Bank of Amsterdam. He had transformed a pile of uncertain, variable, problematic coins into clean, stable, trustworthy banco guilders. He could leave the bank knowing that his money was safe, protected by the vault's thick walls and the city's guards, backed by reserves that matched his deposits 1-to-1, recorded in ledgers that would be maintained with scrupulous accuracy. On that first day, the volume of business wasn't overwhelming. Perhaps a few dozen merchants opened accounts and made deposits. The clerks, who had been anxious about being swamped, found they could handle the pace comfortably. The commissioners observed from a slight distance, ready to intervene if problems arose but trusting their clerks to manage the routine operations. The amounts deposited that first day were substantial without being enormous. Some merchants deposited a few hundred guilders, testing the system with money they could afford to lose if something went wrong. Others, more confident or with greater need for the bank's services, deposited thousands. By the end of the day, the bank held perhaps 50,000 guilders worth of precious metal, a significant sum, but just a beginning. The first week followed a similar pattern. Each day, more merchants arrived to open accounts. Some had been waiting to see how the first day went before committing. Others needed time to gather their various coins and prepare for the deposit process. The flow was steady rather than rushed, which suited everyone. The clerks gained experience and confidence. The procedures, which had seemed complex in abstract planning, became routine through repetition. The commissioners met daily during this first week, reviewing operations and discussing any issues that arose. There were minor problems, as there always are with new systems. Disputes about the valuation of particular coins, a merchant insisting his coins were worth more than the bank's assessment. Confusion about procedures. How exactly does one make a payment from an account? Questions about fees. Why does this service cost that amount? The commissioners addressed these issues with patience and firmness. Their goal was to establish credibility, and credibility required consistency. When valuations were disputed, the commissioners would review the assessment but rarely override their clerks' judgments. The bank's standards had to be maintained. When procedures were unclear, they would explain carefully, sometimes revising the written instructions to make them clearer. When fees were questioned, they would explain the costs of operating the bank and why the fees were necessary and fair. What's remarkable about this period is how undramatic it was. There was no crisis, no moment of high tension, no dramatic validation. The bank simply opened and began functioning. Merchants deposited money. Clerks maintained ledgers. The system worked, quietly and efficiently, exactly as it had been designed to work. But beneath this surface calm, something profound was happening. Trust was being created. Each merchant who deposited money and received it back when he wanted made a small investment in belief. The bank promised that deposits would be safe, that banco guilders would hold their value, that the system would be reliable, and day by day, week by week, the bank kept those promises. The real test came when merchants began using their accounts for payments. This was the bank's true purpose, not just to hold money but to facilitate its transfer. The process was elegant in its simplicity. Suppose Peter, our textile merchant from earlier, wants to pay Hendrik, a grain trader, 500 banco guilders for a shipment of wheat. Instead of withdrawing 500 guilders worth of coins, carrying them to Hendrik, and having Hendrik verify and deposit them, Peter could do something much simpler. Peter would go to the bank and instruct a clerk to transfer 500 banco guilders from his account to Hendrik's account. The clerk would verify that Peter had sufficient balance. Yes, he has 700 banco guilders, so 500 is available. The clerk would then make 2 entries in the ledger, from Peter's account, minus 500 banco guilders, to Hendrik's account, plus 500 banco guilders. The clerk would have Peter sign a document authorizing the transfer, and it was done. No coins changed hands, no weighing, no testing, no uncertainty. Peter's balance decreased by exactly 500. Hendrik's balance increased by exactly 500. The total banco guilders in the system remained the same, just redistributed between accounts, and the precious metal in the vault remained the same, backing all of it. When this began happening regularly, when merchants discovered how much easier payments were through the bank than through physical coins, the value of the system became undeniable. Time saved was money saved. Uncertainty eliminated was risk eliminated. Convenience added to every transaction became competitive advantage. The early months of 1609 saw steady growth. By spring, hundreds of merchants had accounts. By summer, the number was approaching 1,000. The total deposits grew from the initial 50,000 guilders to hundreds of thousands, then toward 1,000,000. The bank was becoming essential infrastructure for Amsterdam's commerce. Foreign merchants began opening accounts too. A trader from Hamburg who did regular business in Amsterdam found it practical to maintain a balance at the bank. An English merchant house opened an account to facilitate payments to Dutch suppliers. Portuguese traders, Baltic factors, French wine merchants. Gradually, Amsterdam's international trading community adopted the bank. This international adoption was particularly significant. It meant that banco guilders were being recognized beyond Amsterdam, becoming a kind of international currency. A merchant in London might instruct his Amsterdam agent to pay a Dutch supplier in banco guilders. The payment would be made through account transfers at the bank, quick and efficient. The banco guilder was becoming the standard unit of account for international trade conducted through Amsterdam. The bank's success created an interesting phenomenon. Banco guilders began trading at a premium over regular guilders. This premium, called the agio, reflected the superior quality of bank money. If you had a physical guilder coin and wanted to deposit it at the bank, you might receive only 95% of a banco guilder, because your coin was probably clipped or worn. Conversely, if you withdrew banco money as coins, you would receive slightly less than the face amount because the coins you received weren't perfect. This agio, the difference between banco money and coin money, was a market signal about value. It showed that banco guilders were more valuable than physical guilders, which made sense. Banco guilders were stable, certain, convenient. Physical guilders were variable, uncertain, inconvenient. People rationally preferred the better money, and that preference expressed itself as a price premium. The existence of the agio also created incentives that reinforced the bank's success. If banco money was worth more than coin money, merchants wanted banco money. To get banco money, they needed accounts at the bank. So more merchants opened accounts, which increased the network effect, which made banco money even more useful, which sustained the premium. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of success. The commissioners watched this development with satisfaction, but also vigilance. The agio was proof that the bank was working, that it was creating value. But they knew that maintaining success required continued discipline. The temptation they faced, and it was a real temptation, was to lend out some of the reserves. Think about the logic of this temptation. The vault held enormous amounts of precious metal, millions of guilders worth of gold and silver, sitting idle, earning nothing. If the bank lent out even a portion of this, say 20 or 30%, it could earn substantial interest. This interest could fund city projects, reduce taxes, enrich the bank's operations, provide benefits to the commissioners themselves, and the risk seemed minimal. Not everyone would want to withdraw their deposits simultaneously. The bank only needed to keep enough reserves to meet normal withdrawal demand. Couldn't they safely lend out a portion without endangering the system? This is the logic that has tempted every banker in history. It's the logic of fractional reserve banking, keeping only a fraction of deposits as reserves while lending out the rest. And in normal times, it works. It allows banks to be profitable. It channels savings toward productive investment. It creates more money in the economy than would exist if every deposit were backed 100% by reserves. But the commissioners of the Bank of Amsterdam resisted this temptation. They understood something crucial. The bank's value lay precisely in its reliability. Merchants trusted banco guilders because they knew, with absolute certainty, that the reserves existed to back them. That certainty was worth more than the profits that could be earned by lending. The decision to maintain full reserves wasn't made once and forgotten. It was a decision that had to be reaffirmed continuously, every time the temptation arose, every time someone suggested that a small loan wouldn't hurt, every time the city faced financial pressures and looked at the bank's idle reserves with longing. The commissioners' integrity in maintaining this discipline was essential to the bank's success, and their integrity was supported by the institutional structure. The commissioners were wealthy merchants serving without salary as a civic duty. They didn't need money from the bank. Their reputations, their most valuable asset in Amsterdam's tight-knit merchant community, depended on the bank's continued reliability. They had every incentive to maintain strict standards and no incentive to risk those standards for short-term gain. By the end of 1609, the bank's first year, its success was undeniable. Thousands of accounts had been opened, millions of guilders worth of deposits had been accepted, thousands of transfers had been executed flawlessly. The system worked. Money had been made reliable. The achievement might seem technical, even boring. There were no battles, no dramatic confrontations, no heroes making stirring speeches, just clerks maintaining ledgers, commissioners enforcing rules, merchants conducting business slightly more efficiently than before. But this quiet achievement was revolutionary. Amsterdam had solved a problem that had plagued commerce for centuries. They had created money that people could trust without testing it, accept without verifying it, use without constant anxiety. The impact rippled outward. Amsterdam's commerce grew even more vibrant. Merchants from across Europe increasingly used Amsterdam as their trading hub, drawn partly by the convenience of the bank. The city's prosperity increased, and with it, tax revenues that funded further infrastructure and institutions. The bank became a point of civic pride, evidence of Amsterdam's sophistication and good governance. Other cities watched with interest and envy. Venice's bank had existed longer but never achieved quite this level of success. Other cities considered imitating Amsterdam but hesitated, uncertain whether they could replicate the combination of factors that made it work: the commercial culture, the governmental integrity, the strict discipline about reserves. For the people of Amsterdam, the bank became invisible, in the way that successful infrastructure always becomes invisible. After a few years, merchants took it for granted. Of course, payments were made through bank transfers. Of course, money was stable and reliable. The anxiety and inconvenience of the old system faded from memory, replaced by the calm assumption that money simply worked. But that invisibility was the ultimate proof of success. The bank had solved the problem so thoroughly that people forgot there had ever been a problem. Money, which had been uncertain and anxious and exhausting, became boring and reliable and trustworthy. And that transformation, quiet and technical as it was, changed everything. To truly understand why the Bank of Amsterdam was revolutionary, we need to look more closely at the mechanics of how it actually worked in daily practice. The elegance of the system lay in details that might seem mundane but were actually quite profound. Let's walk through the life of a banco guilder, from the moment coins entered the vault to the moment they might leave, and explore the beautiful simplicity of what Amsterdam had created. Imagine you're a merchant in 1615, 6 years after the bank opened. You've just completed a successful voyage to the Baltic, and you've returned with payment for your goods, a substantial sum in various currencies. You have Swedish dalers, Polish zlotys, some German thalers from Lübeck, and a scattering of Dutch coins. The entire collection represents perhaps 3,000 guilders worth of value, but in this jumble of different currencies it's hard to be certain. You arrive at the bank carrying your money in a heavy leather bag. The weight of metal is significant. 3,000 guilders worth of silver coins might weigh 20 or 30 pounds. You approach the counter and tell the clerk you wish to make a deposit. He nods, familiar with the routine, and gestures for you to pour out your coins. The assessment begins. The clerk sorts the coins into piles by type. Swedish here, Polish there, German in another group. He consults a book that lists the official precious metal content of hundreds of different coin types. This book is regularly updated as the bank receives information about new coin issues or changes in old ones. It's one of the most valuable resources the bank maintains, a comprehensive catalogue of European coinage. For each type of coin, the clerk weighs a sample. Are these Swedish dalers full weight, or have they been clipped? He places several on his scale, compares them to the standard weight. These particular dalers are slightly light, perhaps 3% under their nominal weight. He makes a note. The Polish zlotys are in better condition, nearly full weight. The German thalers are actually slightly heavy, apparently new from the mint. The valuation proceeds methodically. The clerk calculates the actual silver content of each pile based on the nominal purity of that coin type and the actual weight of your specific coins. Some quick arithmetic. The bank's clerks become very proficient at these calculations, and he arrives at a total. Your 3,000 guilders worth of various coins contains the equivalent of 2,875 banco guilders worth of pure silver. You might feel slightly disappointed. You thought you had 3,000 guilders, but the bank is only crediting you with 2,875. But this is actually fairer than any alternative. Under the old system, you might have accepted those coins at face value, only to discover later that others wouldn't accept them the same way. You were carrying the risk without knowing it. The bank has simply made the risk visible and eliminated it going forward. The clerk records the deposit in the bank's ledger. Your name, the date, let's say it's April 12th, 1615, the amount 2,875 banco guilders. He makes the entry carefully, with clear handwriting that will remain legible for decades. The ledger is permanent record. In the margin, he notes your previous balance. Perhaps you already had 500 banco guilders in your account from earlier deposits. Your new balance, 3,375 banco guilders. He gives you a receipt confirming the deposit. You fold it carefully and place it in your coat. The coins you brought are carried behind the counter and will eventually make their way to the vault. You've transformed uncertain metal into certain value. The anxiety you might have felt about whether those coins were good has been replaced with the calm knowledge that your banco guilders are absolutely reliable. Now let's say a few days later, you need to make a payment. You've agreed to buy a shipment of timber from a merchant named Willem, and the price is 800 banco guilders. In the old system, you would need to visit Willem's place of business carrying 800 guilders worth of coins. Willem would need to verify them, perhaps take them to a money changer for assessment. The process might take hours and cost both of you in fees and time. Instead, you go to the bank. You tell the clerk you wish to transfer 800 banco guilders to Willem's account. The clerk asks for Willem's account details, his full name, perhaps his account number if you know it. You provide the information. The clerk checks the ledger to confirm Willem has an account. Yes, here it is. He then checks your balance, 3,375 banco guilders, plenty to cover the transfer. The clerk picks up his pen. In the ledger, under your account, he makes an entry. To Willem Janssen, timber merchant, 800 banco guilders, April 17th, 1615. He subtracts 800 from your balance, your new balance, 2,575 banco guilders. He then turns pages to find Willem's account. Under Willem's entries he writes, from your name, merchant, 800 banco guilders, April 17th, 1615. He adds 800 to Willem's previous balance. Willem's account increases by exactly the amount yours decreased. The clerk prepares a transfer document, a record of the transaction that both you and Willem will sign. You sign immediately. The document will be sent to Willem, who will sign it and return it to the bank. This signature confirms he received the payment and accepts it. The signed document becomes part of the bank's permanent records, and that's it. The payment is complete. No coins changed hands, no weighing, no testing, no verification. The money moved from your account to Willem's account as quickly as the clerk could make 2 ledger entries. When Willem next visits the bank or receives notification of the transfer, he'll know immediately that he has 800 banco guilders available. He could use them that same day if he wished, transfer them to someone else, withdraw them as coins, let them sit in his account. The choice is his. The beauty of this system becomes even more apparent when you consider the alternatives. If you had paid Willem in physical coins, several things would have happened. First, you would have needed to withdraw 800 guilders worth of coins from wherever you were keeping them, perhaps from your home, where they were vulnerable to theft. You would have carried them through Amsterdam's streets, again risking robbery. You would have met with Willem and presented the coins. He would have examined them, possibly weighing some, possibly taking them to a money changer for verification. The money changer would have charged a fee. There might have been disputes about whether particular coins were acceptable. The whole process might have taken hours and cost both of you in fees and aggravation. With the bank transfer, all of that friction disappeared. The payment was instant, certain, costless, except for the small transfer fee the bank charged. Both you and Willem could be confident in the amount. No disputes, no delays, no anxiety. This efficiency multiplied across thousands of transactions created enormous value for Amsterdam's economy. Think about it this way. If every merchant in Amsterdam saved even an hour per week by using bank transfers instead of handling physical coins, that's thousands of hours freed up for actually doing business instead of managing the mechanics of payment. Time is valuable. The bank created time. The bank's fee structure was designed to be reasonable while covering costs. there was a small fee for deposits, typically less than 1% of the amount deposited. This covered the cost of assessing the coins and maintaining the ledgers. There was a small fee for transfers, a fraction of a percent. This was far less than money changers had charged. There was no fee for simply maintaining a balance. The bank wanted people to keep money in accounts, because deposits backed by reserves in the vault created the foundation for the whole system. Withdrawals were interesting. You could withdraw banco money as physical coins whenever you wanted, but there were incentives not to. First, there was a small withdrawal fee. Second, the coins you received wouldn't be perfect. They would be whatever coins the bank had in its vault that approximated the value you were withdrawing. You would be converting perfect banco guilders into imperfect coins. Third, once you withdrew coins, you lost the convenience of making payments through account transfers. So most merchants kept the bulk of their money in their accounts, and only withdrew coins when they specifically needed physical currency, perhaps to pay workers who didn't have bank accounts, or to take money outside Amsterdam where banco guilders weren't accepted. For transactions within Amsterdam's merchant community, account transfers were simply superior to physical coins. This created the agio we mentioned earlier, the premium of banco money over coin money. By 1615, banco guilders were trading at perhaps 2 or 3% above the value of equivalent coins. If you had 100 banco guilders and wanted to convert them to coins, you might receive only 97 or 98 guilders worth of physical coins. Conversely, if you had 100 guilders worth of coins and deposited them, you might receive only 97 or 98 banco guilders. This agio fluctuated based on supply and demand for bank money versus coins, but it generally remained positive. Banco money was worth more than coin money. This premium was a market signal about value and trust. People valued stability and convenience enough to pay a premium for it. The bank maintained detailed records of the agio, tracking it daily. This information was public. Anyone could learn the current agio by asking at the bank or through merchants who followed such things. The transparency was important. It allowed merchants to make informed decisions about when to deposit or withdraw, and it prevented the bank from manipulating the agio for its own benefit. Let's talk about the vault, because this was the physical manifestation of the bank's promise. The vault held the precious metal reserves that backed every banco guilder in circulation. It was located in the most secure part of the town hall, protected by thick walls and multiple locked doors. Access was strictly controlled. Only the commissioners and a handful of trusted officials could enter. The vault was organized meticulously. Different types of coins were stored separately, silver coins here, gold coins there. Within each category, further organization by origin or type. Everything was counted and recorded. The bank maintained precise inventory of exactly what was in the vault at any given time. Periodically, the commissioners would conduct audits. They would physically count the reserves and compare them to the ledgers. The reserves should match exactly the total banco guilders in all accounts. If there were 3 million banco guilders credited to all the various merchant accounts, there should be 3 million guilders worth of precious metal in the vault. Not approximately 3 million, exactly 3 million. These audits were serious affairs. They might take days, with the commissioners and trusted clerks laboriously counting and weighing and verifying. Any discrepancy, no matter how small, would be investigated until resolved. The commissioners understood that the bank's credibility rested on this one-to-one backing. If it ever became known that the reserves didn't match the deposits, trust would evaporate instantly. In the early decades, the bank's discipline about maintaining full reserves was absolute. There was no lending, no investing, no using deposits for any purpose except backing banco money. This wasn't just policy, it was the bank's fundamental commitment. The commissioners took pride in their integrity, in their refusal to compromise the bank's standards even when it might have been profitable to do so. This discipline created an interesting economic effect. The banco money supply couldn't grow faster than the physical amount of precious metal flowing into Amsterdam. If merchants wanted to open more accounts and receive more banco guilders, they needed to bring in more silver and gold to deposit. This tied the money supply to real economic activity, to Amsterdam's trade balance, to the success of its merchants, to the actual wealth flowing through the city. In a way, this was both a strength and a limitation. It was a strength because it meant banco money was inherently stable. It couldn't be inflated arbitrarily. It was a limitation because it meant the money supply might not grow fast enough to accommodate economic expansion. But for Amsterdam in the 1600s, this limitation wasn't binding. The city's trade was expanding so rapidly that there was always more precious metal arriving, always more deposits being made. The bank also developed procedures for handling special situations. What if someone died? Their account would pass to their heirs, but the bank needed proper documentation, a will or proof of relationship, legal authorization to access the account. What if there was a dispute about a transfer? The bank would review its records and the signed documents to determine what actually happened. What if someone claimed the bank had made an error in a ledger entry? The commissioners would investigate carefully, comparing all records to find the truth. These procedures, developed through experience and codified in the bank's rules, created a legal and administrative framework that inspired confidence. The bank wasn't arbitrary. It followed rules. It maintained records. It could prove what it had done. In a world where trust was often personal, where you did business with people you knew and relied on their honor, the bank offered something different: institutional reliability that didn't depend on personal relationships. Merchants appreciated this impersonal reliability. A merchant from Hamburg who had never visited Amsterdam before could open an account, make deposits and transfers, and trust that the system would work fairly. He didn't need to know anyone personally. He just needed to follow the procedures. The bank's rules applied equally to everyone, foreign and local, rich and poor, though you needed to be successful enough to have an account, familiar and unknown. This universality was radical in its way. In most of 17th century Europe, your economic opportunities depended heavily on who you knew, what family you belonged to, what connections you had. The Bank of Amsterdam wasn't entirely free of such considerations. Accounts still required references, and prominent merchants certainly received deferential treatment. But within the system itself, a banco guilder was a banco guilder regardless of whose account it was in. Money was becoming more abstract, more impersonal, more purely a number in a ledger. The ledgers themselves were works of careful craftsmanship, heavy volumes bound in leather, with thick paper that would last generations. The clerks who maintained them took pride in their penmanship and accuracy. A well-maintained ledger was a thing of beauty. Columns of numbers aligned perfectly, entries made in clean script, no blots or errors or corrections that might raise questions. When a ledger filled up, it would be carefully stored in the bank's archives. These old ledgers were precious records, proof of past transactions, evidence that could be consulted if disputes arose years later. The bank was creating an institutional memory, a paper trail that extended back through time. This was something new in the world, financial records maintained at this scale and with this level of care. Let yourself imagine the sound of the bank during business hours, the scratch of pens on paper as clerks made their entries, the quiet conversations at the counter as merchants gave instructions for transfers, the clink of coins being assessed for deposits, the rustle of pages as clerks turned through ledgers looking for accounts. It wasn't dramatic or exciting. It was steady, methodical, reliable, the sound of a system working exactly as it should. By the 1620s and 30s, the Bank of Amsterdam had become essential infrastructure. Merchants structured their business around it. International trade increasingly used banco guilders as the unit of account. The bank's success spawned imitators. Other cities considered creating similar institutions, though few would match Amsterdam's discipline and reliability. The system worked because every part reinforced every other part. The full reserves meant depositors could trust their money was safe. The trust meant more merchants opened accounts. More accounts meant more network effects. More network effects meant banco money became more valuable. Higher value meant the agio remained positive. The positive agio meant people preferred banco money to coins. The preference for banco money meant deposits continued to flow in, and the continued flow of deposits, matched by reserves in the vault, maintained the foundation of the whole structure. It was a virtuous cycle, a self-reinforcing system of trust and value and reliability, and at its heart was something simple, a promise kept. The bank promised that banco guilders would hold their value, that reserves would back deposits 1-to-1, that the system would be fair and transparent and reliable. Year after year, decade after decade, the bank kept those promises. Trust, once created, maintained itself through continued trustworthiness. This was Amsterdam's gift to the world, the demonstration that money could be made stable through institutions and integrity, that trust could be systematized and scaled, that commerce could be built on reliable foundations rather than constant verification and anxiety. The Bank of Amsterdam wasn't just a place where money was kept. It was a new way of thinking about what money could be. The true test of any institution is not how it performs in perfect conditions, but how it endures through difficulty. The Bank of Amsterdam, having established itself through the 1610s and 20s, would face its real validation as the decades progressed, and as more and more of Amsterdam's commercial life came to depend on the stability it provided. Think about what was happening in Amsterdam during these middle decades of the 17th century. The city was at the height of its power, the centre of a global trading network that stretched from the Caribbean to Japan. Dutch ships dominated the seas. The VOC was bringing unprecedented wealth from the East Indies. Amsterdam's merchants were financing ventures across the known world. The city's population had grown to over 200,000, making it one of Europe's great metropolises. All of this commerce rested increasingly on the foundation of the bank. By the 1630s, the bank held deposits equivalent to millions of guilders. The number of accounts numbered in the thousands. On any given day, hundreds of transfers might be recorded in the ledgers. The volume of activity was far beyond what the founding commissioners could have imagined in 1609. But volume wasn't the only measure of success. What mattered more was how thoroughly banco money had been woven into the fabric of commercial life. Merchants didn't think about whether to use the bank anymore. They simply did. Prices for wholesale goods were quoted in banco guilders. Contracts specified payment in banco money. International correspondents instructed their Amsterdam agents to make payments through bank transfers. The banco guilder had become the standard, the assumed unit of account and medium of exchange for serious commerce. This ubiquity created a kind of confidence that was more powerful than any official decree. When everyone uses banco money, when it's simply how business is done, questioning it seems almost eccentric. A new merchant arriving in Amsterdam would observe how others conducted their affairs and naturally adopt the same practices. The bank's success perpetuated itself through social proof and habit. Foreign merchants particularly came to appreciate what Amsterdam had created. Consider a merchant from London who regularly bought Baltic grain through Amsterdam. In London, monetary chaos still reigned. Dozens of different coins, constant uncertainty about value, the need for money changes and verification. But when dealing through Amsterdam, the English merchant could instruct his agent to hold a balance at the Bank of Amsterdam. Payments could be made swiftly and certainly. The contrast between Amsterdam's monetary order and London's chaos made the English merchant appreciate what good institutions could accomplish. This appreciation had practical effects. Merchants preferred to route their trade through Amsterdam partly because of the bank. If you were a French wine merchant selling to a Polish buyer, you might arrange for payment through Amsterdam even if the wine never went near the city. The buyer would send coins to Amsterdam, deposit them at the bank, transfer banco guilders to your account, and you would withdraw coins or transfer them to someone else. Amsterdam became a clearinghouse for international commerce, and the bank was the mechanism that made it work. The bank's success also created interesting secondary effects. One was the development of a market in bank balances. Merchants who needed banco money quickly might buy it from others rather than going through the deposit process. Someone with excess balances might sell them for a small profit. This created a kind of primitive foreign exchange market specifically for banco guilders. The agio, the premium of banco money over coin money, became an important economic indicator. Merchants watched it the way we might watch stock indices today. When the agio rose, it meant demand for banco money was increasing relative to supply. This might signal that trade was picking up, that more merchants needed balances for transactions. When the agio fell slightly, it might indicate easier monetary conditions, more deposits flowing in. Experienced merchants learned to read these signals and adjust their business accordingly. The bank itself carefully monitored the agio. The commissioners understood that a stable agio was important. Too high, and it might discourage deposits because the cost of entry was steep. Too low, and it might suggest that banco money was losing its premium status. An agio in the range of 2 to 4% seemed ideal, enough to reflect banco money's superior qualities, but not so much as to be burdensome. Maintaining the right agio required subtle management. The bank couldn't directly control it. The agio was set by market forces, by supply and demand. But the bank could influence it through its policies on deposits and withdrawals. If the agio was rising too high, the bank might make depositing slightly easier or cheaper. If it was falling too low, the bank might adjust withdrawal policies slightly. These were marginal adjustments, never dramatic interventions, but they helped maintain equilibrium. The bank's physical operations expanded along with its success. The original space in the town hall became inadequate. More clerks were needed to handle the volume of transactions. More ledgers had to be maintained. The vault had to be enlarged to hold the growing reserves. The city invested in these expansions, understanding that the bank was vital infrastructure worth supporting. The clerks who worked at the bank developed specialized expertise. Maintaining the ledgers was skilled work that required accuracy, attention to detail, and complete trustworthiness. A clerk who made errors or who could be bribed would be dismissed immediately. The bank's reputation depended on its clerks being incorruptible and precise. In return, the positions were well paid by the standards of the time and carried prestige. Being a bank clerk was a respected occupation. The commissioners, too, took their responsibilities seriously. These were still unpaid positions, civic duties performed by wealthy merchants, but the prestige of being a commissioner was significant. It marked you as someone the city trusted with crucial responsibilities. Former commissioners often went on to higher civic offices, becoming burgomasters or serving in other important positions. The bank was a training ground for civic leadership. Over time, traditions developed around the bank's operations. The annual audit of the vault became a formal ceremony, with the commissioners gathering to verify that reserves matched deposits exactly. The opening of new ledgers was marked with care, the first entry made by the senior commissioner. When long-serving clerks retired, they were honoured for their years of faithful service. These traditions reinforced the seriousness of the bank's work and the dignity of its staff. Let's consider a specific moment to make this concrete. Imagine it's 1645, 36 years after the bank opened. A wealthy merchant named Klaus van Dam is making his regular visit to the bank to review his accounts and conduct some business. Klaus is in his 60s, a man who has been using the bank since its early years, and who has watched it evolve from innovation to institution. Klaus approaches the familiar counter. A clerk he knows, Peter, who has worked here for 20 years, greets him with professional courtesy. Klaus wants to know his current balance, and Peter turns to the ledger, finds Klaus's account and reports 14,632 banco guilders. Klaus nods. He knew approximately what it should be, but he likes to verify. He instructs Peter to make several transfers: 500 banco guilders to a timber merchant for a recent shipment, 300 to a grain dealer, 800 to a French wine merchant who has provided goods for Klaus's taverns. Peter makes the entries smoothly, the pen moving across the page in practice strokes. Each transfer takes perhaps 2 minutes. In the old days, before the bank, these payments might have taken Klaus the better part of a day. With his transfers complete, Klaus's balance is now 12,032 banco guilders, a substantial sum representing years of successful trading. Klaus keeps most of his liquid wealth in his bank account. It's safer than keeping it at home. It's more convenient for making payments. And the slight premium of banco money over coins means his wealth is actually appreciating slightly even as it sits idle. As Klaus leaves the bank, he reflects on how much has changed since his youth. He remembers the anxiety of dealing with dozens of types of coins, the constant trips to money changers, the disputes and delays. Those problems seem distant now, almost quaint. The bank has made them disappear so thoroughly that younger merchants probably can't even imagine what commerce was like before. This everyday interaction, Klaus and Peter, the transfers, the updated balance, multiplied thousands of times across thousands of merchants, was the bank at work. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make history books, just the quiet efficiency of a system functioning as designed. But this quiet efficiency was itself remarkable. The bank had made money boring in the best possible way. The bank's success also attracted attention from beyond Amsterdam. Other cities sent representatives to study how it worked. Hamburg established its own bank in 1619, explicitly modelling it on Amsterdam. Venice reformed its existing bank to operate more like Amsterdam's. Other Dutch cities, Rotterdam, Middelburg, Delft, created their own banks. These institutions varied in their success, but they showed that Amsterdam's innovation was recognized as valuable and worth emulating. What made Amsterdam's bank especially influential was its combination of public ownership, full reserves, and strict discipline. Many other banks tried to cut corners, maintaining partial reserves, making loans, using deposits for other purposes. Some of these banks succeeded for a while, but many eventually failed when depositors lost confidence. Amsterdam's conservative approach looked boring and unprofitable, but it was sustainable in ways that more aggressive approaches weren't. The bank also played a subtle role in Amsterdam's broader financial ecosystem. While the bank itself didn't lend money, it coexisted with private banks and money lenders who did. A merchant might keep his main balance at the Bank of Amsterdam for safety and convenience, but borrow from a private bank to finance a trading voyage. The two types of institutions served different functions. The public bank provided stability and payment services. Private banks provided credit and took risks. This division of labour worked well. Merchants could be aggressive in their business ventures, taking on debt to finance ambitious projects, knowing that their core savings were safe at the public bank. If a private bank failed, and some did, it was painful for those involved but didn't threaten the whole system. The Bank of Amsterdam remained solid, its reserves intact, its depositors protected. There were periodic suggestions that the Bank of Amsterdam should expand its services. Why not make loans? Why not pay interest on deposits? Why not invest reserves to generate profit? These suggestions usually came from people who didn't understand the bank's fundamental purpose, or who prioritized short-term gain over long-term stability. The commissioners consistently rejected such proposals. They understood that the bank's value lay precisely in what it didn't do. It didn't lend, so there was no risk of bad loans. It didn't invest, so there was no risk of investment losses. It didn't pay interest, so it didn't need to earn returns to cover interest payments. It simply held deposits, maintained reserves, and facilitated transfers. This narrow focus was a strength, not a limitation. The intellectual clarity of this approach was remarkable for the time. In an era when the theory of banking was still being worked out, when economists were still debating basic questions about money and credit, Amsterdam's commissioners had intuited or learned through experience what modern economists would later formalize: that banking can serve different purposes, that deposit-taking and lending can be separated, that stability requires discipline. By mid-century, the Bank of Amsterdam had accumulated a track record of nearly 40 years without a major crisis. No bank runs, no scandals, no failures of the reserve requirement. Generations of merchants had conducted business through the bank without ever losing money due to bank failure. This track record was itself an asset, building confidence that was almost impossible to shake. Young merchants growing up in 1640 or 1650 took the bank completely for granted. It had always been there in their lifetimes. The idea of commerce without banco money would have seemed strange to them, like commerce without ships or warehouses. The bank had become part of the natural landscape of Amsterdam business. This invisibility, this taken-for-granted quality, was the ultimate proof of success. When an institution works so well that people stop thinking about it, when it becomes assumed background rather than conscious choice, it has achieved a kind of permanence. The Bank of Amsterdam had become infrastructure in the deepest sense, essential, reliable, unremarkable in its excellence. The bank had also created, almost accidentally, a kind of financial data that hadn't existed before. The ledgers, with their detailed records of transfers and balances, provided information about Amsterdam's commerce. Historians studying the bank's records centuries later would be able to reconstruct trading patterns, identify merchant networks, understand the flow of money through the economy. At the time, the bank didn't think of its ledgers as historical data. They were just operational records. But they created an archive of economic life that was unprecedented in its detail and completeness. The city of Amsterdam, watching the bank's success, felt validated in its decision to create it. The initial investment, building the vault, hiring staff, establishing procedures, had paid off enormously. The bank had enhanced Amsterdam's attractiveness as a trading centre. It had reduced transaction costs throughout the economy. It had demonstrated the city's sophistication and good governance. And it had done all this while requiring minimal ongoing subsidy. The bank's fees covered its operating costs. For the commissioners serving in the 1640s and 50s, the bank was both easier and harder than it had been for the founders. Easier because procedures were established, because staff was experienced, because the system worked and didn't require constant innovation. Harder because the responsibility was so much greater. So many merchants depending on the bank, so much money in the vault, so much to lose if anything went wrong. But nothing did go wrong. The bank continued its steady operation year after year, decade after decade. The virtuous cycle of trust and reliability and success continued. The foundation that had been laid in 1609 proved solid enough to support a vast structure of commerce and confidence. Amsterdam had created something that worked, and by working, it validated the vision of those who had believed that money could be made stable through institutions and integrity. Let that image settle. 40 years of success, of promises kept, of trust maintained. The bank as it was in mid-century, mature, established, essential, a quiet triumph of human cooperation and careful design. But this success would also contain the seeds of future challenges, because success creates its own temptations, and institutions that seem eternal can prove fragile in ways their creators never anticipated. The success of the Bank of Amsterdam invites a natural question. What made it different? Why did this bank succeed so thoroughly when others had failed or achieved only partial success? The answer isn't simple or singular. The bank's achievement rested on a constellation of factors that came together in Amsterdam in ways that were difficult to replicate elsewhere. Let's begin with the most obvious difference. The Bank of Amsterdam was a public institution, owned and operated by the city government, not a private enterprise run for profit. This public character shaped everything else. The bank's purpose wasn't to make money for shareholders. It was to provide a public good, stable currency and efficient payment systems that would benefit the entire commercial community and thereby benefit the city as a whole. This distinction might seem subtle, but it was profound. A private bank faces constant pressure to maximize profits. The reserves sitting in the vault represent opportunity cost, money that could be earning returns if it were lent out or invested. The temptation to use those reserves, to engage in fractional reserve banking, is enormous. Even with the best intentions, private bankers find it difficult to resist the lure of profit from idle assets. The Bank of Amsterdam, being public, could resist this temptation more easily. Its commissioners weren't trying to maximize profit. They were trying to maintain stability and trust. They could afford to keep reserves completely idle because the benefit, reliable currency, accrued to the city broadly, not to the bank narrowly. The bank's success was measured not in profits, but in the smooth functioning of Amsterdam's commerce. This public character also meant the bank had the backing of the city government. The full faith and credit of Amsterdam stood behind the bank's promises. This government backing was enormously valuable. It meant depositors knew that if anything went wrong, the city would make them whole. It meant foreign merchants could trust that the bank wouldn't simply disappear or renege on its obligations. The stability of the Dutch Republic and the wealth of Amsterdam guaranteed the stability of the bank. Compare this to private banks of the era, which rose and fell with the fortunes of their owners. If a private banker made bad loans or invested poorly, the bank could fail, and depositors would lose their money. There was no guarantee, no backing beyond the banker's personal wealth. The risk was real and ever-present. Amsterdam's public bank eliminated this risk, or at least reduced it to the vanishing point. But public ownership alone wasn't sufficient. Venice had a public bank, yet it never achieved quite the same level of success as Amsterdam's. What else made the difference? The full reserve requirement was crucial. Amsterdam's bank maintained a one-to-one backing of deposits with precious metal reserves. This wasn't legally required in a binding sense. There was no law that could force the commissioners to maintain full reserves, but it was policy, enforced by the commissioners' integrity and by periodic audits that verified compliance. Full reserves meant absolute safety. No matter how many depositors showed up wanting to withdraw their money, the bank could pay them all. There was no possibility of a classic bank run where early withdrawals get their money, but late ones find the vault empty. Every banco guilder in circulation was backed by an equivalent amount of metal sitting in the vault. This safety came at a cost. Full reserves meant the bank couldn't profit from lending. Millions of guilders worth of gold and silver sat idle, earning nothing. From a purely profit-maximizing perspective, this was wasteful. But from a stability perspective, it was essential. The entire system rested on the certainty that reserves existed and would always exist to back deposits. The discipline required to maintain this policy, decade after decade, cannot be overstated. Every year, the commissioners faced the same temptation: lend out just a portion of the reserves. The city always needed money for public works, for defence, for 100 worthy projects. The reserves could fund those projects, and surely, not everyone would want to withdraw deposits simultaneously. Keeping, say, 80% reserves would still be safe, wouldn't it? But the commissioners resisted. They understood that once you started making exceptions, once you compromised the principle of full reserves, you were on a slippery slope. If 80% reserves were acceptable, why not 70%? And if 70, why not 60? Where would you draw the line? Better not to start down that path at all. This discipline was enforced by the commissioners' personal integrity and by Amsterdam's civic culture. The commissioners were wealthy merchants who had made their fortunes and were now serving the public good. They didn't need the money that lending reserves might generate. Their reputations were their most valuable asset, and those reputations depended on the bank remaining trustworthy. The social and professional consequences of compromising the bank's standards would have been severe. Amsterdam's broader civic culture supported this integrity. The city's government, while oligarchic, controlled by wealthy merchant families, was relatively uncorrupt by the standards of the time. There was a strong tradition of civic duty, of wealthy citizens serving the public good without expectation of personal enrichment. This wasn't altruism exactly. These merchants benefited from a well-governed, prosperous city. But it created an environment where maintaining public institutions with integrity was both expected and respected. Compare this to many other European cities where government positions were seen primarily as opportunities for personal enrichment, where corruption was endemic, where public and private interests were thoroughly entangled. In such environments, creating a public bank with substantial reserves and expecting officials not to help themselves was naive. Amsterdam's civic culture made institutional integrity possible in a way that was rare. The bank also benefited from Amsterdam's position as a commercial centre. The sheer volume of trade flowing through the city meant there was constant demand for the bank's services. Merchants needed to make large payments frequently. International traders needed reliable settlement systems. The bank wasn't serving a small marginal market, it was serving the beating heart of global commerce. This volume created powerful network effects. The more merchants used the bank, the more useful it became to use the bank. If you were one of only a dozen merchants with an account, transfers would be of limited use. But when thousands of merchants had accounts, you could conduct almost all your business through bank transfers. The system became self-reinforcing. Usage drove more usage. Amsterdam's legal system also mattered. The city had strong property rights and reliable contract enforcement. Merchants could trust that agreements would be honoured, that disputes would be resolved fairly, that property wouldn't be arbitrarily confiscated. This legal reliability was essential for banking. Depositors needed to know that their property rights in their bank balances would be respected, that the city wouldn't simply seize the bank's reserves for its own use. Again, this might seem obvious, but it wasn't universal in 17th century Europe. Many rulers saw wealthy institutions as sources of forced loans or outright confiscation. A king facing financial crisis might seize a bank's assets and promise to repay later, a promise often broken. In Amsterdam, such arbitrary action was unthinkable. The city's government was restrained by law and custom. Property rights were sacred. The bank's narrow focus was another source of strength. It didn't try to do everything. It took deposits, maintained reserves, and facilitated transfers. That was it. No lending, no investing, no complex financial instruments. This simplicity made the bank easier to manage and harder to mismanage. There were fewer ways for things to go wrong. Other banks tried to combine multiple functions, deposit-taking and lending, money changing and foreign exchange, domestic and international operations. This complexity created risks and opportunities for failure. Amsterdam's bank avoided these risks through its deliberate simplicity. Do one thing, do it well, and don't get distracted by other opportunities. The transparency of the bank's operations also built confidence. The agio was public information. The audit results were known to the merchant community. The fees were clearly stated. There were no hidden charges or mysterious practices. Merchants understood how the bank worked and could verify that it was working as promised. This transparency was unusual for the time. Many financial institutions operated with deliberate opacity, keeping their practices secret, mystifying their operations. Sometimes this secrecy protected proprietary methods, but often it hid questionable practices. Amsterdam's bank had nothing to hide and benefited from making its operations clear and understandable. The bank also benefited from the quality of its staff. The clerks who maintained the ledgers were skilled professionals, well paid, and carefully selected. Errors in the ledgers could be catastrophic. Imagine if accounts were mixed up or balances wrongly recorded. The bank needed absolute accuracy, and it got it by hiring competent people and treating them well enough that they wouldn't risk their positions through corruption or sloppiness. In some other cities, banking staff were poorly paid and poorly supervised. Errors were common. Corruption was expected. Depositors had to worry not just about the institution's soundness, but about whether individual clerks might steal from them. Amsterdam's bank eliminated these worries through professional management and adequate compensation. The timing of the bank's creation also mattered. 1609 was the right moment. Amsterdam's commerce was expanding rapidly. The monetary chaos was reaching a critical point. The merchant community was ready for a solution. If the bank had been created decades earlier, when Amsterdam's trade was less developed, it might not have found enough users. If it had waited decades later, alternative solutions might have emerged, or the problems might have become so entrenched as to be unsolvable. There's an element of contingency here, of historical accident. Amsterdam happened to have the right combination of factors at the right time. Trying to replicate this success elsewhere was difficult precisely because these factors were hard to duplicate. Consider why Hamburg's bank, created in 1619 and explicitly modelled on Amsterdam's, never quite matched its success. Hamburg was a major trading city, a member of the Hanseatic League, with significant commerce. It had the resources to create a public bank. It had capable administrators. But it lacked some of Amsterdam's advantages. Hamburg's commerce, while substantial, wasn't as vast or diverse as Amsterdam's. The network effects weren't quite as strong. Hamburg's civic culture, while respectable, wasn't quite as committed to institutional integrity. Over time, Hamburg's bank would face pressures that Amsterdam's resisted more successfully. The discipline of full reserves would be harder to maintain. The bank would survive and even prosper, but it would never achieve quite the legendary status of Amsterdam's. Or consider Venice, whose bank predated Amsterdam's. Venice had been a great commercial power with centuries of banking experience. The Venetians understood finance deeply. They had invented or perfected many financial instruments. Yet Venice's bank never became as central to that city's commerce as Amsterdam's bank did. Part of the reason was that Venice's bank had been created to solve a somewhat different problem, managing the city's public debt as much as stabilizing currency. It had been compromised from the start by the city's financial needs. Venice's government borrowed from the bank, which meant reserves were never fully intact. This lending wasn't necessarily bad policy. It helped Venice manage its finances, but it meant the bank couldn't offer the absolute certainty that Amsterdam's did. The differences between Amsterdam's success and others' partial success highlight what was truly remarkable about the Dutch achievement. It wasn't just creating a bank. Many cities had banks. It was creating a bank with such discipline, such integrity, such focus on its core mission that it became something new, not just a private business chartered by government, but a true public institution devoted entirely to providing monetary stability. The bank embodied an idea that was still being worked out in the 17th century, that some functions are best performed by public institutions devoted to the common good rather than by private enterprises seeking profit. Money is a public good in the sense that everyone benefits from monetary stability. The externalities of monetary chaos, the costs imposed on everyone by an unreliable currency, are large. And the benefits of stability can't easily be captured by any private actor. Amsterdam's insight was that monetary stability was important enough to warrant a public institution focused entirely on providing it, even if that institution didn't generate direct profit. The indirect benefits, enhanced trade, reduced transaction costs, increased prosperity, more than justified the commitment of public resources to maintaining the bank. This was a sophisticated understanding of public goods and institutional design. It wasn't articulated in modern economic terminology. That language didn't yet exist. But the commissioners and burgomasters who created and maintained the bank understood intuitively what later economists would formalize: that markets don't automatically provide all socially valuable goods, that some things require collective action and public commitment. The Bank of Amsterdam was, in this sense, a triumph of institutional imagination. It showed that money didn't have to be chaotic, that trust could be systematized, that public institutions could perform functions that private actors struggled with. These insights would influence thinking about central banking, about public finance, about the proper role of government in economic life for centuries to come. But the bank's success also contained a paradox. The very excellence of its design and operation made it hard to improve or adapt. The commissioners became conservative guardians of a proven system. Change seemed risky. Why modify something that works so well? This conservatism was appropriate in many ways. The bank's core mission didn't require innovation. Stability meant keeping things the same. Yet economies evolve, trade patterns shift, new instruments and practices emerge. An institution that remains static while the world around it changes can gradually become less relevant, even as it maintains its core functions perfectly. The Bank of Amsterdam would face this challenge in the centuries ahead: how to preserve its essential virtues while adapting to changing circumstances. For now, though, in the middle decades of the 1600s, these challenges were distant. The bank was succeeding beyond its founders' hopes. It had solved the problem it was created to solve. It had created stable money in a world of monetary chaos, and in doing so it had demonstrated that human beings could design institutions that worked, that served the common good, that maintained integrity over time. This demonstration was perhaps the bank's most important contribution, not just solving Amsterdam's monetary problems, but showing that such problems could be solved through thoughtful institutional design and disciplined implementation. Let these comparisons rest in your mind. Think about how rare it is for institutions to work as intended, to maintain their integrity, to serve their purpose decade after decade without corruption or failure. The Bank of Amsterdam did this, and in doing it showed what was possible when civic virtue, sound design, and favourable circumstances aligned. The period from roughly 1650 to 1750 represents the Bank of Amsterdam at its zenith, a century during which the institution achieved such complete success that it seemed almost eternal, a permanent feature of European commerce as fixed and reliable as the tides. Let's explore what this golden age looked like, both in the grand sweep of statistics and in the intimate details of daily operation. By 1650, the bank held deposits equivalent to approximately 16 million guilders. This was an enormous sum, more money than many small countries possessed in their entire treasuries. The number of active accounts numbered in the thousands, representing virtually every significant merchant in Amsterdam and many from across Europe. On a typical business day, hundreds of transfers would be recorded. The ledgers filled up steadily, each completed volume added to the archives where they would rest for centuries, silent witnesses to the flow of commerce. The vault beneath the town hall had been expanded several times to accommodate the growing reserves. Imagine descending the stairs into that vault, cool stone corridors lit by lanterns, guards stationed at intervals. The weight of the building above creating a sense of massive solidity. The vault rooms themselves were organized with meticulous care. Shelves and chests held coins sorted by type and origin, Spanish silver from the Americas, German thalers from a dozen different principalities, French écus, English pounds, Dutch guilders of various ages and conditions, and gold coins glinting in the lamplight, concentrated wealth in physical form. The commissioners conducted their annual audits with the same seriousness of purpose that had characterized the bank's founding. These audits were elaborate ceremonies, taking days to complete. Every coin would be counted, every chest opened and inventoried, every tally verified against the ledgers. The total reserves had to match exactly the total banco guilders credited to all accounts. This verification wasn't pro forma, it was genuine, careful examination. The The commissioners understood that the entire system rested on this correspondence between paper promises and metallic reality. And year after year, decade after decade, the audits confirmed what depositors trusted. The reserves were intact, the promises were kept, the system was sound. This track record, accumulating through time, became an asset in itself. A bank that had maintained full reserves for 50 years, then 60, then 70, inspired a confidence that no new institution could match. The Bank of Amsterdam had survived wars, plagues, economic fluctuations, political upheavals, and through it all, the reserves remained, the deposits were safe, the transfers continued. Let's consider the wars, because these were significant tests of the bank's resilience. The 17th century was not a peaceful time. The Dutch Republic fought multiple wars with England, commercial rivals competing for maritime dominance. There were conflicts with France, with various German states, with Spain even after the formal end of the 80 Years' War. These wars disrupted trade, created uncertainty, strained the city's finances. During wartime, one might expect people to lose confidence in institutions, to withdraw their money and hoard it. But the Bank of Amsterdam experienced no such crisis. Merchants understood that their money was actually safer in the bank than anywhere else. If Amsterdam fell to an enemy, an unthinkable but theoretically possible calamity, having coins at home wouldn't help you. But as long as Amsterdam remained free, the bank would honour its commitments. Indeed, during wars, the bank became even more valuable. The efficiency of bank transfers became crucial when speed mattered. The ability to make large payments without physically transporting vulnerable shipments of coins was essential when seas and roads were dangerous. The bank didn't just survive wartime, it proved its value in crisis. The plague years of the mid-1600s also tested the bank. Plague periodically swept through European cities, killing thousands. Amsterdam suffered several outbreaks. During these times, normal commerce slowed or stopped. People avoided public spaces. Some merchants fled to the countryside. Yet the bank continued operating, with reduced staff perhaps, but maintaining its core functions. Deposits remained safe. Balances could be checked. Critical transfers could be executed. The bank provided continuity when everything else seemed uncertain. Through all this, the agio, the premium of banco money over coin money, remained relatively stable. It fluctuated certainly, rising during times of high demand for bank services and falling when demand eased. But it never disappeared. Banco guilders were consistently worth more than equivalent amounts of coin. This premium was market recognition of value. People valued stability, convenience, and safety enough to pay for it. By the early 1700s, the Banco guilder had achieved something remarkable. It had become a genuinely international currency. Oh, it didn't circulate physically outside Amsterdam. Banco guilders existed only as ledger entries in the bank's books. But as a unit of account, as a way of denominating values and settling debts, Banco guilders were used across Europe and beyond. A merchant in London might owe a debt to a merchant in Danzig, and they might agree to settle in Banco guilders. Neither the London merchant nor the Danzig merchant needed to handle actual Banco guilders. They would work through their Amsterdam correspondents, who maintained balances at the bank. The London merchant's agent would transfer Banco guilders to the Danzig merchant's agent, and the debt would be settled. This convenience, this ability to make payments across vast distances with certainty and speed, made Banco guilders enormously useful. The bank facilitated, without quite intending to, the emergence of Amsterdam as a clearing centre for international trade. Bills of exchange drawn on Amsterdam, payable in Banco guilders, circulated throughout Europe. These bills were trusted because Banco guilders were trusted. You could hold a bill promising payment in Banco guilders with confidence that when you presented it for payment, you would receive exactly the stated amount, with no disputes about coin quality or exchange rates. This international role enhanced Amsterdam's commercial dominance. Merchants preferred to route trade through Amsterdam partly because settlement was so efficient. A merchant in Lisbon selling to a buyer in Stockholm might ship goods directly between those cities, but arrange payment through Amsterdam. The Lisbon merchant would have an agent in Amsterdam who would receive Banco guilders from the Stockholm buyer's agent, then transfer them to the Lisbon merchant's own account or to someone else according to his instructions. The volume of this international business was enormous. The bank's ledgers recorded thousands of transfers each month, many of them representing international transactions. Amsterdam was intermediating a substantial fraction of European trade, earning fees and commissions on this intermediation, and the bank was the infrastructure that made it possible. The daily life of the bank during these golden years had settled into comfortable routines. The clerks arrived early in the morning before merchants began appearing. They would review the ledgers from the previous day, prepare for the day's business, ensure everything was in order. The head clerks, senior men who had been with the bank for decades, would supervise, checking the work of junior clerks, making sure standards were maintained. When the doors opened for business, merchants would arrive in steady stream. Some came almost daily, active traders who needed to make frequent payments. Others came weekly or monthly, checking balances and making occasional transfers. The atmosphere was professional and courteous. The clerks knew many of the merchants personally, greeted them by name, understood their businesses. But this familiarity didn't mean sloppiness. Every transaction was recorded with the same care, whether it was for a long-time customer or a new account holder. The commissioners maintained oversight without micromanaging. They would visit the bank periodically, review the books, check that procedures were being followed. They handled unusual situations, disputes about transfers, questions about fees, applications from foreign merchants seeking accounts. But day-to-day operations were left to the experienced clerks. The system worked because everyone knew their role and performed it competently. The bank had become so successful that it generated modest revenue beyond its operating costs. The fees charged for deposits, withdrawals, and transfers, modest as they were, added up when applied to millions of guilders worth of transactions annually. This surplus went to the city treasury, a small but steady income stream that helped fund Amsterdam's government without raising taxes. This financial contribution was less important than the broader economic benefits the bank provided, but it demonstrated that public institutions could be efficient, that providing public goods didn't require endless subsidies. The bank paid for itself, and then some, all while serving the public interest rather than private profit. The bank's archives grew steadily. Each completed ledger was carefully stored. By 1700, the archives contained decades' worth of records, hundreds of ledgers documenting millions of transactions. These records were occasionally consulted when disputes arose or when merchants needed to verify past payments. But mostly they sat undisturbed, a paper memory of Amsterdam's commercial history accumulating dust in secure rooms. The bank building itself, still located in the town hall, had been improved and maintained over the years. The counter where merchants conducted business was made of fine wood, polished smooth by decades of use. The floors were clean, the windows let in good light. The atmosphere was dignified without being intimidating. The bank projected stability and competence in its physical presence just as it did in its operations. Let's consider a specific year to make this concrete. Say, 1700, the turn of a new century. The bank is 91 years old, nearly a century of continuous operation without a major crisis. The commissioners that year are men who have never known Amsterdam without the bank. For them, it's simply part of the city's infrastructure, as natural and necessary as the canals or the harbour. The deposits that year stand at perhaps 20 million guilders. The number of transfers processed annually is in the hundreds of thousands. The bank employs several dozen clerks, supervised by a handful of senior administrators, all overseen by the commissioners. The operation is routine in the best sense. Everything works as it should, day after day, month after month. A young merchant just starting in business in 1700 would open his first account at the bank as a matter of course. His father had an account. His grandfather had an account going back to the bank's early decades. Using banco guilders isn't a choice to be debated. It's simply how serious business is conducted. The young merchant might not even know the history, might not realize that the bank was created to solve specific problems. For him, it's just the way things are. This generational transition, from people who remember the pre-bank era to people who take the bank for granted, marks a kind of success. Institutions that become invisible through excellence, that are so reliable they cease to be noticed, have achieved something profound. The bank's founders wanted to create stable money. They succeeded so completely that stability became the default, the assumed background against which commerce occurred. The international reputation of the bank was at its height during this period. Foreign economists and political thinkers wrote about it as a model institution. Travellers visiting Amsterdam made sure to see the bank, even if they couldn't access the vault. It became a symbol of Dutch excellence, of the benefits of good governance and sound institutions. This reputation wasn't just pride, it had practical value. The fact that the Bank of Amsterdam was famous and trusted meant Amsterdam attracted more commerce. Merchants wanted to do business through a city with such reliable institutions. Investors felt safe placing capital in Amsterdam. The bank's reputation reinforced Amsterdam's position as Europe's financial centre. Yet even at this zenith, careful observers might have noticed some subtle changes. Amsterdam's commercial dominance, while still impressive, was no longer growing as rapidly as it had in the 1600s. Other cities, London particularly, were developing their own sophisticated financial institutions. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was a different kind of institution than Amsterdam's bank. It made loans, it managed government debt, it engaged in activities Amsterdam's bank avoided. But it was effective in its own way, and it helped England compete with Dutch commercial power. The world of commerce was evolving. New instruments were being developed, more sophisticated bills of exchange, insurance contracts, derivative instruments for hedging risk. Amsterdam remained important, but it was no longer the sole centre of financial innovation. The Bank of Amsterdam, with its conservative focus on its narrow mission, wasn't at the forefront of these innovations. It did what it did superbly, but what it did was increasingly just one part of a more complex financial ecosystem. The bank's very success created a kind of complacency. Why change what works so well? The commissioners were guardians of a proven system. They weren't innovators looking to expand services or adapt to new conditions. This conservatism made sense in many ways. The bank's core mission didn't require innovation, but it also meant the bank was slowly becoming less central to cutting-edge finance, even as it remained essential for basic commercial payments. None of this represented crisis or failure. The bank continued to function beautifully. It maintained full reserves, it processed transfers efficiently, it provided exactly the services it was created to provide. Merchants continued to value and use it. The agio remained positive. By any reasonable measure, the bank was succeeding. But success can be static or dynamic, defensive or expansive. The Bank of Amsterdam's success was increasingly static and defensive. It held ground, maintained standards, kept promises. These were admirable qualities. But the most dynamic elements of European finance were happening elsewhere, in institutions more willing to take risks and try new things. The irony is that the bank's greatest strength, its absolute reliability, its unchanging nature, its refusal to compromise its conservative principles, was also, in subtle ways, becoming a limitation. The bank was frozen in excellence, perfect for the purposes it served, but unable to evolve as those purposes shifted. In the early 1700s, this limitation wasn't yet apparent. The bank was still at the height of its influence and importance. But the seeds of future challenges were being planted. Amsterdam's relative economic position was slowly declining, even as the city remained wealthy and important. The bank's role, while still central, was no longer as dominant as it had been. For now, though, the golden years continued. The bank operated with the smooth efficiency of a well-made clock. The reserves sat secure in the vault, the ledgers filled with careful entries. Merchants conducted their business with the calm confidence that their money was safe and their payments certain. Amsterdam's commerce flowed through the bank's accounts like water through the city's canals, essential, continuous, taken for granted. It was a remarkable achievement, a human institution that worked as designed for decade after decade, that kept faith with depositors, that maintained integrity in a world where integrity was rare. The Bank of Amsterdam in its golden age showed what was possible when vision, discipline, and favourable circumstances aligned. It deserved its reputation. It earned the trust placed in it. And for a century that trust was never betrayed. Let that image rest. The bank at its peak, successful beyond its founders' dreams, essential to European commerce, a model studied and admired across the continent. Stability incarnate, reliability made tangible, trust transformed into institutional form. The golden years, when everything worked and all promises were kept. And so we've travelled together through the canals of 17th century Amsterdam, through counting houses and ledger books, through the quiet revolution of an idea made real. We've watched as people struggled with the eternal problem of trust, how to create value that endures, how to build systems that serve the common good, how to transform chaos into order through nothing more than integrity and careful design. The Bank of Amsterdam showed us something timeless, that institutions can work when built with wisdom and maintained with discipline. That trust, once earned through consistency, becomes its own foundation. That sometimes the most profound innovations are the quietest ones. Not dramatic breakthroughs, but patient solutions to everyday problems, sustained across generations. You've been part of this story tonight, part of the long human effort to create order from uncertainty, to build systems that let us cooperate and flourish together. The merchants of Amsterdam faced challenges we still face. They found answers that still echo in our modern world. Their wisdom, earned through trial and patience, remains. Wherever you are right now, in whatever century you find yourself, know that you're part of this continuing story, that the work of building trustworthy systems, of maintaining integrity, of choosing long-term stability over short-term gain, this work continues. Rest now in that knowledge. Let the story settle into your mind like silt drifting to the bottom of a calm canal. The banco guilders have long since disappeared, but the lesson endures. Trust built slowly, promises kept faithfully, systems designed with care. Sleep well. Dream of counting houses and candle-lit ledgers, of coins sorted in silent vaults, of trust made tangible. Let yourself drift like a ship on Amsterdam's canals, carried gently toward rest. Good night.